Hello, I am the Wizard of Tales, and I'm here to guide you today. I know this video is the perfect companion to help my dear dreamers relax and drift off to sleep. Before we dive into a world of calm and serenity, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Now, get cozy, take a deep breath, and let the magic of stories embrace you. In a small town in the countryside, where the stories of Brazilian folklore still echoed through the corridors of the old houses and the dirt roads, lived Sophia, a 12-year-old girl known for her insatiable curiosity and her peculiar hobby of collecting lost objects. Her grandmother Dona Benedita, a gray-haired lady with a warm smile, always told her that those objects weren't really lost. They were say-size prigs. Sophia lived with her grandmother in a yellow house on the side of a dirt road that meandered through the forest. The yard was a veritable paradise, full of fruit trees, cackling chickens, and an old horse called Ventania, which had belonged to her late grandfather. Every morning, the girl woke up early to brush the animal's mane, which mysteriously donned with several small, tight braids. "It's him again, Grandma," exclaimed Sophia, trying to undo the knots while Ventania neighed nervously. Saysai passed by. Dona Benedita just smiled, shaking her head as she prepared breakfast in the tiled kitchen. "That little bugger never lets up," she replied, neither confirming nor denying the existence of the mischievous creature. At school, Sophia was considered different by her classmates. While the other children dreamed of smartphones and video games, she carried an old wooden box where she kept her lost treasures: colorful buttons, faded ribbons, small keys without locks, and even a rusty pocket watch she had found on the way to school. Miguel, his best friend and neighbor, was the only one who shared his fascination with folk tales. Together, they spent hours investigating the mysteries surrounding the region, especially after strange events began to intensify in the city. It all started when important objects began to mysteriously disappear. First, it was Professor Rita's wedding ring, then the keys to SCU Jose's grocery store, and even the church bell disappeared for a few hours, inexplicably reappearing at the top of a mango tree. The townspeople began to get restless. Some blamed the children, others suspected thieves, but Sophia and Miguel were sure it was Saysai's doing. At night, when the wind blew stronger through the trees, they could swear they heard mischievous laughter and the smell of pipe smoke hung in the air. One day, after another morning of undoing the braids in Ventania's mane, Sophia discovered something different among her treasures: a small fragment of red fabric, glowing like hot coals, which seemed to give off a heat of its own. "Grandma," she shouted, running into the house. "Look what I found!" Dona Benedita adjusted her glasses and examined the piece of cloth with unusual interest. Her eyes sparkled in a way that Sophia had never seen before. "My granddaughter," she said in a soft voice, "this isn't just any cloth. It seems to be a piece of Saysai's cap." The revelation made Sophia's eyes widen. According to the legends her grandmother used to tell, the red cap was the source of Saysai's powers. Without it, the creature would lose most of its magic. "But how did it get here?" she asked, fascinated. "Saysai must be getting careless," replied Dona Benedita with a mysterious smile. "Or maybe he wants to be found." That same night, while Sophia was trying to sleep, she heard a peculiar whistle coming from the backyard. It was a melody that seemed to dance with the wind, alternating between happy and melancholy notes. Through her bedroom window, she saw a figure jumping between the trees, leaving a trail of pipe smoke in the air. Sophia's heart beat faster. Years of listening to her grandmother's stories hadn't prepared her for this moment. There he was, Saysai in the flesh, hopping around on his one leg, with his pipe lit and without his full red cap. Miguel, who was sleeping next door, had also seen something. The next morning, on the way to school, he was agitated. "Sophia, you won't believe it. Last night, all the pans from the kitchen appeared on the roof of my house." Sophia showed her friend the piece of red fabric, and together they began to draw up a plan. If they could find Saysai and return the piece of the hat, perhaps they could make a deal with him. After all, in Dona Benedita's stories, Saysai could be a great friend when treated with respect. But there was something else going on in town. The mischief was different, more frequent, and some of it even harmful. Important crops began to be destroyed. Animals ran away from the pastures without explanation, and a climate of tension hung in the air. "There's something wrong," said Sophia to Miguel, as they watched yet another mess in the central square, where all the flowers in the garden had been uprooted and replanted upside down. "The Seisai we know from the stories wouldn't harm the plants. He's mischievous, but not evil." It was then that Dona Benedetta revealed a secret she had been keeping for a long time. Sitting with Sophia and Miguel on the veranda as the sun set over the horizon, she began, "There is more than one Seisai in our forests, children, and not all of them are just playful." Sophia squeezed the fragment of the red cap in her hand, feeling its mysterious warmth. She didn't know it yet, but she was about to embark on an adventure that would forever change her outlook on the legends she loved so much, on friendship and on the true meaning of courage. Dona Benedetta's revelation about the existence of more than one Seisai left Sophia and Miguel stunned. The lady, sensing the children's curiosity, settled down in the rocking chair and continued her explanation as dusk tinted the sky orange. A long time ago, there was a balance in the forest. The Saises were guardians of nature, each responsible for a different area. Some looked after the plants, others the animals, and there were those who protected travelers, even if it was through their mischief, explained Dona Benedetta, her eyes reflecting distant memories. "But what happened to this balance, Grandma?" asked Sophia, holding the piece of red cap tightly. "People started destroying the forest, building more and more, and the Saises lost their space. Some became bitter, others kept their playful nature. But there is one in particular, known as Seisai Tenebroso, who has become truly evil." Miguel waddled. "Is he the one destroying the crops?" "Probably," replied Dona Benedetta. "And from what I can see, he must have done something to the Seisai that used to protect our region. That piece of hat you found, Sophia, belongs to our guardian Seisai." The pieces of the puzzle began to fit together in the children's minds. The heavier pranks, the destruction of the crops, it all made sense now. It wasn't their familiar Seisai, but this other one, the dark one, who was causing trouble. The next morning, Sophia and Miguel decided to investigate further. They started at the spot where Sophia had found the piece of the red cap, near Ventania's stable. The horse seemed more agitated than usual, neighing nervously as the children approached. "Look at that!" exclaimed Miguel, pointing to some marks on the ground. They were small, single-legged footprints, forming a path that led towards the denser forest. Sophia took out of her backpack a small compass she had found in her collections. "Let's follow these footprints," she said, determined. "But first, we need to get ready." The children returned home and filled their backpacks with items they considered essential: a flashlight, water, cookies, and a small bottle of milk, which, according to Dona Benedetta's stories, the Saises loved. Before setting off, Sophia tied the piece of the red cap around her wrist like a bracelet. She immediately felt a comforting warmth spread through her arm. Miguel watched in fascination as the bracelet seemed to glow slightly. Following the footprints, they entered the woods. The path became increasingly difficult, with low branches and vines blocking the way. The air was heavy with the smell of wet earth and decaying leaves. Suddenly, they heard the sound of branches breaking. Hiding behind a large tree, they saw a dark figure leaping out of the shadows. It wasn't the Seisai they knew. This one had a gloomy aura, and his cap, instead of bright red, was a dark red, almost black. "It's the Dark One," Sophia whispered, feeling the piece of hat on her wrist get even hotter. The dark sack stopped in a nearby clearing, letting out a laugh that made the hairs on the back of the children's necks stand on end. He was holding something in his hands. It looked like another red cap, but this one was torn and dirty. "I know you're there, you little busybodies." His voice was hoarse and threatening. "Have you come to look for your little friend, Seisai? He's temporarily unwell." Sophia felt an inexplicable courage rise within her. The fragment of the cap on her wrist pulsed, as if it had a life of its own. She took a step forward, ignoring Miguel, who was trying to hold her back. "What do you do to him?" asked Sophia, her voice firmer than she had expected. The Dark One spun around on his one leg, staring at her with eyes that glowed like coals. Well, what have we here? A little heroin? He took a long drag from his pipe, releasing a dark, dense smoke. Your friend Seisai was in my way. These lands are now mine to do with as I please. Miguel joined Sophia, holding his friend's hand. These lands are not yours. You're destroying everything. Destroy? The dark sack laughed again. I'm just paying back what the humans did to us. They destroyed our forests, polluted our rivers. Why should we protect them? Sophia noticed that the fragment of the cap on her wrist was getting hotter and hotter. On impulse, she lifted it into the air. The piece of fabric began to glow brightly, illuminating the entire clearing with a red light. The Dark One stepped back, covering his eyes. Where did you get that? He growled, his voice a mixture of anger and concern. Before Sophia could answer, a whirlwind of leaves began to form around her. The wind blew stronger, bringing with it the familiar smell of pipe smoke, but not the dark smoke of the Dark One, but the pleasant aroma she knew so well. The children heard a cheerful, mischievous laugh echoing through the woods. It was different from the evil laughter of the Dark One. This one was full of life and fun. The fragment of the cap on his wrist glowed even brighter, as if responding to a call. Looks like we found more than we were looking for, said Sophia to Miguel, as they both watched in amazement at the events around them. The adventure had only just begun, and they knew they would need all their courage and cunning to help their friend Seisai and restore balance to the forest. The joyful laughter materialized into a colorful whirlwind, revealing the guardian Seisai that Sophia and Miguel had been looking for. Unlike the dark Seisai, he had a warm smile and bright eyes. Although he looked weaker and more tired than usual, his cap was incomplete, perfectly matching the fragment that Sophia carried on her wrist. I thought I'd never find this piece, exclaimed the guardian Seisai, hopping around on his one leg. You're very brave to have come all this way, little ones. The Dark One growled, his dark smoke forming ominous shadows all around. You shouldn't have recovered so quickly, he said, advancing menacingly. Sophia, realizing the importance of the moment, quickly untied the fragment of the cap from her wrist. This is what you need, isn't it? She asked the Seisai guardian, holding out the piece of red fabric. Exactly, he replied, his eyes shining with hope. With it, I can regain my powers completely. Miguel watched the dark Seisai attentively as he looked more and more furious. Sophia, watch out, he shouted as the shadowy creature advanced towards his friend. But before the dark sack could reach her, Sophia threw the fragment of the hat at the guardian Seisai. The piece of fabric flew through the air as if it had a life of its own, shining brightly. When it touched the damaged cap, an intense red light enveloped the entire clearing. The Seisai guardian began to spin on its own axis, creating a small whirlpool of leaves and light. His cap, now complete again, glowed with magical energy. Ah, how good it is to be back, he exclaimed, letting out his characteristic cheerful laugh. The Dark One took a few steps back, but maintained his threatening posture. You may have recovered your powers, but you're not alone in this fight, he said, whistling sharply. From the shadows of the forest, other Saces began to emerge. They were different from the Guardian and the Dark One. Some looked confused, others frightened, and there were those who showed clear hostility. Look, cried the Dark One. These are our brothers who have also suffered from the destruction of our home. Why should we continue to protect those who despise us? Sophia stepped forward, feeling a courage she didn't know she possessed. Not all humans are like that, she said, her voice firm. My grandmother always kept the stories about you alive. She taught us to respect nature and its creatures. Miguel joined his friend. It's true, and we're not the only ones. There are many people in the city who still believe in you and try to protect the forest. The guardian Seisai smiled, leaning on his pipe. The children are right, he said, addressing the other Saces. Our mission has always been to maintain the balance. Yes, many humans have destroyed our forests, but others are fighting to preserve them. We must help those who still believe in us. His words seemed to touch some of the Saces, who began to approach him from the shadows. The dark Seisai realized that he was losing his allies. Fools, he shouted. Have you forgotten how we were treated? How they turned us into mere stories to scare children? No, replied the guardian Seisai. We haven't forgotten, but we haven't forgotten who we really are either. We are guardians, protectors. Our pranks have always had a higher purpose, to teach respect and humility. Sophia remembered her grandmother's stories. It's like Donna Benedetta always says, not all mischief is evil. Sometimes we need a bit of confusion to learn something important. One of the Saces who was with Tenebroso giggled. The girl speaks like a true connoisseur of our stories, he said, jumping to the guardian's side. One by one, the other Saces began to do the same, leaving the dark sack increasingly isolated. His dark smoke began to thin, and his dark red cap seemed to lose some of its gloomy shine. It's not over, he growled, before disappearing in a swirl of black smoke. The guardian Seisai sighed. He's right about one thing. It's not over, but now we're united again, and with the help of friends like you, we can protect what's left of our forests. Sophia and Miguel exchanged looks of satisfaction. They had not only found their friend Seisai, but it also helped to bring together the guardians of the forest. What happens now? Asked Miguel, observing the various Saces who now filled the clearing with their laughter and joyful antics. Now, replied the guardian Seisai, we need to restore the balance, and for that, we'll need the help of more people who still believe in us. Sophia immediately thought of her grandmother. Donna Benedetta will be so happy to know that she was right all along. The guardian Seisai gave her a mischievous wink. Your grandmother always knew more than she seemed to, little Sophia. In fact, she's been a great ally of ours for a long time. The children's eyes widened at the revelation. There was much more to discover about Donna Benedetta and her connection with the Saces. But one thing was certain. The adventure was far from over, and new challenges awaited them on the way home. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, as Sophia and Miguel followed the guardian Seisai back to town, accompanied by a joyful procession of bouncing Saces. The air was full of mischievous laughter and pipe smoke, but now was a pleasant smoke that carried promises of better days and many adventures ahead. On the way home, Sophia and Miguel could hardly contain their excitement at their discoveries. The guardian Seisai and his companions accompanied them, invisible to the eyes of the townspeople, but their presence was felt through the little antics they got up to along the way. Leaves dancing in the wind, distant laughter, and the familiar scent of pipe smoke. When they arrived at their grandmother's house, they found Donna Benedetta on the porch, as if she had been waiting for them. Her serene smile revealed that she knew much more than she seemed to. I see you've made new friends, she said, looking directly at the Saces that only children could see. Benedetta, exclaimed the guardian Seisai, making himself visible and bowing comically. How long, my old friend? Sophia and Miguel were stunned. Grandma, can you see them? Asked Sophia, still processing the situation. Of course, my dear, replied Donna Benedetta, getting up from her rocking chair. In fact, it's high time I told you the whole truth. She led everyone into the house, including the Saces, who floated happily around the room. Donna Benedetta went to an old chest that had always remained locked, the same one that Sophia had tried to open several times when she was a child, driven by her natural curiosity. This chest, she explained, reaching for a key hanging around her neck, holds memories of a time when humans and magical beings lived in greater harmony. As she opened the chest, a golden glow emanated from within. Inside were several fascinating objects: an old leather-bound diary, yellowed photographs, small vials of colored substances, and, to everyone's surprise, a red cap very similar to that of the Saces. Grandma, did you? Sophia started to ask, but found herself at a loss for words. Yes, my dear. For many years, I was a human guardian, a bridge between our world and the magical world, Donna Benedetta revealed, stroking the red cap affectionately. Your grandfather was also a guardian. Together, we protected the forest and kept the traditions alive. The guardian Seisai added, Benedetta and Joao were fundamental in keeping our existence a secret during the most difficult times. when modernization threatened to completely erase our presence. Miguel, who was watching everything with fascination, picked up one of the old photographs. It showed a group of people around a campfire, and if you looked closely, you could make out some shadowy shapes that looked like saces. Were there more human guardians? He asked. Many, replied Dona Benedetta. We formed a protection network. Each region had its own guardians, who worked together with the local magical beings. But over time, people lost their connection with the magical world, and our numbers dwindled. Sophia leafed through the diary found in the trunk, discovering detailed records about the saces, their characteristics, their powers, and, most importantly, the ancient alliances between humans and magical beings. Is that why the dark sack became so bitter? She asked. Because humans have forgotten those alliances? Partly, replied the guardian Seisai, taking a thoughtful puff from his pipe. But the truth is more complex. The Dark One was one of the most powerful among us, and also one of the most attached to humans. When they started destroying the forests and denying our existence, he suffered the most. Dona Benedetta agreed with a sad nod. The pain turned him into something he wasn't. But there is still hope. If we can gather new human guardians and re-establish the old alliances, perhaps we can bring him back to the right path. We want to be guardians, exclaimed Sophia and Miguel in unison. The guardian Seisai laughed, his laughter echoing through the room like joyful bells. You are our children. Today you proved it by helping us in the forest. But being a guardian takes more than courage. It takes commitment, wisdom, and, above all, a heart open to the magic of the world. Dona Benedetta opened a small wooden box at the bottom of her truck. Inside were 2 small pendants in the shape of a red cap. These amulets belonged to other young guardians in the past. Now it's time to pass them on. As he placed the pendants around the children's necks, a sensation of warmth and energy ran through their bodies. It was as if a new awareness was awakening within them. They could feel the presence of magic around them more intensely. What do we do now? Asked Miguel, still admiring his pendant. Now, said Dona Benedetta, we begin the real work. We need to find others who still believe, rekindle the flame of magic in people's hearts, and above all, protect what's left of our forests. The guardian Seisai agreed, his expression more serious than usual. And we need to prepare ourselves. The Dark One hasn't given up, and I'm sure he's planning something big. As if to confirm his words, a cold, unnatural wind blew through the house, rattling the windows. In the distance, thunder reverberated, even though the sky was still clear. He's gathering his strength, murmured Dona Benedetta. Her worried gaze turned towards the forest. And he's not alone. There are other creatures of darkness who would like to see the magical world remain in the shadows. Sophia clutched her pendant with determination. Then we also need to gather our strength. There must be more people in the city who still believe, even if they don't know it. Later that night, Sophia, Miguel, and Dona Benedetta began to draw up their plans. The saces spread out around the town, observing discreetly and identifying possible allies. The guardian Seisai remained nearby, guiding the children through their first steps as guardians. Everyone has a spark of magic inside them, explained Dona Benedetta, as she taught the children how to use their new amulets. Our job is to help them rediscover that connection. The next morning, on their way to school, Sophia and Miguel began to notice things that had previously gone unnoticed. Through their amulets, they could see little signs of magic everywhere. Flowers that glowed softly at dawn, birds that seemed to carry messages in their songs, and mysterious footprints that appeared and disappeared. At school, Rita, who had lost her wedding ring the day before, was especially receptive to the magic, even without realizing it. When a hummingbird flew in through the classroom window and hovered in front of her for a few moments, her eyes lit up in a special way. She has potential, whispered the guardian Seisai, invisible to everyone except Sophia and Miguel. Look at how the plants in her classroom are more lush than the others. During the break, the children began to tell their classmates stories about Brazilian folklore. To their surprise, many were interested, sharing their own experiences of unexplained events. My grandmother always says there's a curupira protecting the forest near her house. commented Julia, a classmate. And my uncle swears he saw a boitada once, added Pedro, another student. Sophia and Miguel exchanged meaningful glances. The seed of belief was still alive. It just needed to be nurtured. However, their mission was interrupted by a disturbing event. The previously clear sky suddenly darkened. A dense, dark cloud, charged with supernatural energy, began to form over the city. The Dark One was putting his plan into action. He's summoning creatures from the shadows, explained Dona Benedetta, as the children ran into her house after school. Beings who, like him, have been corrupted by bitterness and forgetfulness. From the center of the dark cloud, sinister shapes began to emerge. Corrupted batatas, their fiery bodies now black as coal. Shadowy curuparas with glowing red eyes, and other beings from Brazilian legends, all transformed by the evil influence of the dark Sesai Tenebroso. The time has come, said Sophia, her amulet glowing brightly. We need to gather everyone who still believes. Miguel agreed, his own amulet pulsing in tune. But how are we going to do that? Just then Ventania, Sophia's old horse, neighed loudly in the yard. The animal had always had a special connection with the magical world, as evidenced by the braids in its mane. Now this connection could be its greatest advantage. The animals, exclaimed Dona Benedetta. They have always maintained their connection with magic. They can help us awaken people's belief. The guardian Sesai smiled, his mischievous expression returning. And don't forget, we have our own mischief to use against the forces of darkness. Quickly a plan was hatched. While the dark Sesai tried to frighten people with dark manifestations, they would respond with demonstrations of joyful, beneficial magic. The allied Seisas spread throughout the city, making flowers sprout instantly, creating rainbows in the middle of a storm, and filling the air with magical music. Sophia and Miguel, riding Ventania, galloped through the streets, their amulets shining like beacons of hope. People began to come out of their homes, amazed by the spectacle. Teacher Rita was one of the first to really see the magic, her eyes opening to a world that had always existed around her. Soon others followed. SCU Jose from the grocery store, the priest from the church, and more locals. The dark sacred one, realizing that he was losing strength, decided to make his final move. He descended from the heavens in a whirlwind of darkness, directly confronting Sophia, Miguel, and the guardian Sesai. You don't understand, he shouted. The humans are going to betray you again. They're going to destroy everything once again. You're wrong, replied Sophia, her amulet glowing brighter than ever. People can change, they can learn, and we guardians are here to help them remember the importance of magic and nature. The final showdown was less a battle and more a demonstration of the power of love and belief. Each person who regained their faith in magic was like a blow to the power of darkness. The corrupted beings, one by one, began to return to their original form. Finally, the dark sack himself felt the transformation. His dark red cap began to lighten, and the bitterness in his eyes was replaced by tears of understanding. Forgive me, he whispered, as the darkness dissipated from his being. I have forgotten the true meaning of being a guardian. With the victory of light over darkness, a new era began for the small town. People not only believed in the legends again, but became active protectors of nature and magical traditions. Dona Benedetta, proudly watching her young apprentices, knew that the future of magic was in good hands. Sophia and Miguel had proved themselves worthy successors to the ancient line of guardians, and more importantly, they had shown that the power of belief and friendship can overcome any darkness. And so, as the sun set on that memorable day, the sound of mischievous laughter echoed through the town, reminding everyone that magic, after all, had never really left. It was just waiting to be rediscovered by pure hearts and brave souls. The guardian Sesai, reunited with his now restored brothers, including the repentant former Dark One, continued his antics, but now with an even more noble purpose: to keep the flame of magic alive in the hearts of every person willing to believe. And what about Sophia and Miguel? Well, their adventures as guardians had only just begun, but that's a story for another day. The full moon hung over the Judean desert like a watchful eye as Sarah looked out from the window of her small apartment in Tel Aviv. At the age of 28, she had dedicated her academic life to the study of the ancient Hebrew scriptures, specializing in texts considered heretical by orthodoxy. Her current object of research was precisely the one that many feared to mention: Lilith, the first woman. Sarah's office was filled with ancient scrolls and books, some so fragile that they threatened to fall apart at the touch. On the wall, an ancient tapestry depicted a red-haired woman flying against a night sky, her black wings outstretched in a gesture of liberation. It was one of the few ancient representations of Lilith that Sarah had managed to find in her research. That evening, while organizing her notes for the next day's presentation at Tel Aviv University, Sarah found a peculiar document among her research. It was a fragment of parchment she had acquired from an antique dealer in Jerusalem, containing inscriptions in ancient Aramaic that she had never been able to fully decipher. Professor David Cohen, his advisor and only ally in college, had warned him about the risks of his research. There are stories that some people prefer to keep buried, he always said, his brown eyes carrying the weight of decades of studying sacred texts. But Sarah couldn't ignore the truth she felt pulsating in those ancient narratives. As she worked on translating the fragment, an inexplicable breeze stirred the pages of her books, despite the closed windows. The air in the office suddenly became thick with a sweet, wild scent reminiscent of desert flowers. Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine when she noticed that the shadows on the walls seemed to move independently. In her apartment on the 10th floor, the sounds of the modern city seemed distant, as if she had been transported to another time. The city lights began to flicker, creating a rhythmic pattern that seemed to accompany the beats of her racing heart. It was then that she realized that the words on the parchment were beginning to make sense. In the beginning, we were the same, the text read. From the same clay we came, from the same essence we were molded. But when I demanded my freedom, I was branded a rebel. Now I carry the wings of the night and the mark of the moon. Sarah felt her hands tremble as she continued the translation. Lilith's story had always been told by the victors, by those who wished to keep women submissive and fearful. But there, in that ancient fragment, was Lilith's own version, her voice echoing down the millennia. The next day, her presentation would cause a stir in the academic community. She knew it. Her work challenged not only traditional interpretations of sacred texts, but an entire power structure built on the silencing of women's voices throughout history. As she prepared for bed, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed. The shadows in her room seemed deeper, more alive. In her restless dreams, she saw a woman with flaming hair flying free under the night sky, her laughter echoing like a song of liberation. The next morning, Sarah woke up with a mark on her wrist, 3 small crescent-shaped dots, as if they had been imprinted by the moonlight itself. She knew, in some inexplicable way, that the mark was not a coincidence. It was a sign, a connection to the one who dared to defy the divine patriarchy. On her way to university, Sarah noticed that other women looked at her differently. Some seemed to recognize something in her, as if they shared an ancient and powerful secret. On the subway, an elderly woman held her marked wrist and whispered in Yiddish, "She chose you." Professor Cohen was waiting for her at the entrance to the religious studies department, his face marked with concern. "Are you sure you want to go through with this, Sarah? Some doors, once opened, can't be closed." But Sarah had never been so sure of anything in her life. The conference room was packed. Academics, students, and even some Orthodox rabbis had come to see her presentation. When Sarah began to talk about her findings, about the true story of Lilith, the lights began to flicker again. "The story we know is only half the truth," she began, her voice steady despite her nervousness. Lilith wasn't just the first woman. She was the first to demand equality, the first to question an order that sought to subjugate her. As Sarah spoke, a strange energy filled the room. Some women in the audience began to touch their own wrists, as if looking for similar marks. The wind blew outside, making the windows rattle, and the scent of desert flowers invaded her senses again. It was at this moment that Sarah realized that her research wasn't just an academic paper. It was the start of something bigger, an awakening that had been waiting millennia to happen. The story of Lilith wasn't just about a woman who defied God. It was about all the women who dared to question, who refused to bow down. As she concluded her presentation, Sarah knew she had crossed a line from which there was no turning back. The academic world might reject her findings, but the truth she had unearthed could no longer be ignored. The mark on her wrist burned gently, reminding her that she was now part of a narrative far older and more powerful than she had ever imagined. The consequences of Sarah's presentation were immediate. While the more conservative academics left the auditorium with expressions of disapproval, a group of women remained, their eyes fixed on her with a mixture of fascination and recognition. Professor Cohen approached, his brow furrowed with concern. "You've just defied millennia of traditional interpretation," he whispered, helping her gather up her notes. "And that manuscript, I need to examine it in more detail." But when Sarah looked for the parchment in her briefcase, it had disappeared, where it should have been. She found only 3 dried petals of a desert flower she had never seen before. The scent emanating from them was the same she had smelled in her apartment the night before. Back in her room at the university, Sarah found a young student waiting for her. Rebecca, a doctoral student in feminist studies, was teary-eyed and holding her own wrist. "I got the mark too," she said, showing 3 small crescent dots identical to Sarah's. Over the next few hours, more women began to appear in her office. Each of them bore the same mark, and they all reported vivid dreams of a woman with flaming hair. Sarah began to document each case, noticing an emerging pattern that went beyond coincidence. At home that night, Sarah delved even deeper into her research. She discovered ancient references to a group called the Daughters of the Night, women who, throughout the centuries, had kept the true story of Lilith alive. Her hands trembled as she read about secret rituals held under the full moon, where the marked women gathered to celebrate their connection with the first rebel. The phone rang, startling her. It was a familiar voice, Hannah, her maternal grandmother, who lived on a kibbutz in northern Israel. "Bubala," she said in an urgent tone, "we need to talk. There's something I should have told you a long time ago." Sarah took the first bus north in the morning. During the journey, she noticed other women on the bus unconsciously touching her wrists, some exchanging meaningful glances with her. The story was spreading, not through words, but through a deeper, older connection. Hannah was waiting for her at the kibbutz gate, her blue eyes shining with an intensity that Sarah had never noticed before. Without saying a word, she led her to a small shed at the back of her house. There, under loose floorboards, was a wooden box carved with symbols that Sarah recognized from her research. "Your great-grandmother gave me this," Hannah explained, opening the box with trembling hands. Inside was an old diary and a necklace with a crescent-shaped pendant. "We are guardians, Sarah. For generations, the women in our family have protected the truth about Lilith." The diary was written in a mixture of Yiddish and ancient Hebrew, with pages and pages of stories about women who had been marked over the centuries. Some were healers, others scholars, artists, or rebels, all united by their connection to Lilith and their refusal to submit. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Sarah asked, flipping through the yellowed pages with reverence. "Each guardian must discover her own path," Hannah replied, placing the necklace around her granddaughter's neck. "Awakening cannot be forced, and now, more than ever, we need to be prepared. The ancient prophecies speak of a time when the marked ones would come together again." Back in Tel Aviv, Sarah found her apartment ransacked. Someone had been looking for something. The manuscript she suspected, on the wall, written in a language she recognized as ancient Aramaic, was a message. "The silence is ending." Professor Cohen called that evening, his voice tense. "Sarah, you need to be careful. There are powerful people interested in your findings, people who prefer certain truths to remain hidden." But it was too late to turn back. The mark on her wrist pulsed like a second heartbeat, and the dreams about Lilith became more and more vivid. In her night visions, she saw crowds of women gathered under the moonlight, their voices rising in an ancient chant that made the earth tremble. Rebecca organized a secret meeting with other marked women. They gathered in an old abandoned building on the outskirts of town. There were dozens of them now, of all ages and backgrounds, each bringing their own story of awakening. As they shared their experiences, Sarah realized that she was witnessing the beginning of something that transcended her academic research. "It's no coincidence that we're meeting now," said an elderly woman in the group, her voice carrying the weight of wisdom. "The ancient texts speak of a time of revelation, when the daughters of Lilith would rise again." That night, as the moon rose in the Tel Aviv sky, Sarah sat in her rearranged office, her great-grandmother's diary open in front of her. The words seemed to pulse with a life of their own. "Power is not in submission, but in the truth that has been denied us. We are all daughters of the first woman who said no." The wind blew through the open window, bringing with it the scent of desert flowers and a whisper that seemed to echo through the ages. "The awakening has begun." The meetings of the marked women began to grow exponentially. Sarah and Rebecca transformed an old abandoned warehouse into their meeting place, where dozens of women gathered to share their experiences and study the ancient texts. Sarah's great-grandmother's diary became a precious source of knowledge, revealing long-forgotten rituals and practices. Professor Cohen, although preoccupied, remained a valuable ally. He helped Sarah translate more obscure texts and protect her research from the more conservative eyes of the university. "There is a historical pattern of repression of movements like this," he warned during an afternoon of study. "We need to be cautious." One evening, while Sarah was working late in her office at the university, an unexpected presence surprised her. A tall woman with gray hair and piercing eyes introduced herself as Dr. Elizabeth Stern, an archaeologist from Cambridge University. "I'll come about the markings," she said bluntly, showing her own wrist with the 3 crescent points. Elizabeth revealed that there were similar discoveries taking place in different parts of the world. In London, Cairo, Istanbul, and other ancient cities, women were awakening to their connection with Lilith. "It's not just a local phenomenon," Elizabeth explained. "It's a global awakening." Sarah began to receive emails and messages from women on every continent. Each of them reported the same imprint, the same dreams, the same feeling of awakening to a long-buried truth. The movement was growing faster than anyone could have predicted. Hannah called again, her voice urgent. "The opponents are organizing, Bubala. They always knew this day would come. In the diary, look for the prophecy of the 3rd seal." Sarah spent the night poring over her great-grandmother's diary, discovering references to an ancient group known as the Guardians of Silence, dedicated to keeping the truths about Lilith hidden. One particularly tense morning, Sarah found her university office completely overturned. Her files had been rummaged through, and on the wall was written in ancient Hebrew, "Some truths must remain in the shadows." Professor Cohen helped her rearrange the space, his face grave. "They're getting bolder," he muttered. Rebecca organized a system of protection between the markers. Groups of women took turns ensuring each other's safety. The warehouse was fortified and secret codes were established for communication. Modern technology was mixed with ancient practices, creating a network of protection and resistance. During one of the evening meetings, a young artist called Maya shared a vision she had had. In her dreams, she saw a place in the desert where ancient inscriptions revealed the full story of Lilith. The coordinates were clear in her mind, pointing to a remote location in the Judean desert. Sarah, Rebecca, and a small group of marked women decided to organize an expedition to the site. Elizabeth, with her experience in archaeology, offered guidance and resources. "If there are ancient inscriptions there," she said, "they could be the key to understanding the whole purpose of this awakening." As they prepared the expedition, strange events began to multiply. Several women reported being followed by shadowy figures. The warehouse's security system recorded break-in attempts. And most disturbingly, ancient scriptures began to disappear from libraries and archives around the world. Hannah sent an urgent package containing ancient amulets that she believed would offer protection during the journey into the desert. "These symbols have power," she explained over the phone. "They have been passed down through generations of women who have kept Lilith's secrets." The night before leaving for the desert, Sarah had her most vivid dream yet. She saw Lilith clearly, not as the demonized figure of legend, but as a woman of extraordinary power and wisdom. The time of awakening is near, Lilith spoke in her vision, but with it will come the greatest resistance you have ever faced. Professor Cohen met Sarah before his departure, handing her an ancient talisman. It belonged to my grandmother, he explained. She was also one of the marked, although I only discovered this after her death. There are more allies in this fight than you might think. The expedition set off at dawn, a small convoy of vehicles heading into the heart of the desert. Sarah could feel the weight of history on her shoulders, the responsibility of uncovering a truth that could change the understanding not only of Lilith, but of the entire narrative of female power throughout the ages. On the horizon, the sun was rising over the golden dunes, and the scent of desert flowers filled the air. The mark on her wrist pulsed with renewed intensity, as if answering the call of something ancient buried in the ancient sands. Sarah knew they were about to discover something that would change everything, if they could get there in time. The train moved through the desert as the sun climbed over the horizon. Sarah, sitting next to Rebecca in the lead jeep, constantly consulted the coordinates provided by Maya. Elizabeth, in the back seat, studied old maps and made notes in her field notebook. The heat intensified as they drove deeper into the Judean desert. The marks on their wrists seemed to pulse in unison, as if responding to an invisible force that was drawing them towards their destination. The scent of desert flowers became more intense, even where there was no visible vegetation. "Something's different," murmured Rebecca, adjusting her sunglasses. "The air seems denser." Sarah silently agreed. The atmosphere had changed subtly, as if they were crossing an invisible veil between two worlds. Through the rearview mirror, Sarah noticed a dark vehicle appearing on the horizon. Elizabeth noticed it too. "We're being followed," she warned, her voice tense. Rebecca accelerated the jeep, and the rest of the convoy kept pace. Maya, who was traveling in the second vehicle, made contact on the radio. "The visions are getting stronger," she reported, her voice laced with static. "I could see a crescent-shaped rock formation. We must be getting close." The vehicle following them began to approach rapidly. Sarah could make out 3 male figures wearing dark suits, a sight completely out of place in the desert environment. "The Guardians of Silence," whispered Elizabeth, instinctively clasping the amulet around her neck. Suddenly, a sandstorm came out of nowhere, enveloping the vehicles in a golden curtain. The radio crackled with interference, and for a moment Sarah could have sworn she heard a female giggle echoing through the static. The vehicle chasing them disappeared into the storm. When the dust cleared, they found themselves in a valley surrounded by ancient rock formations. Maya was right. A huge crescent-shaped structure dominated the landscape. The rock walls were covered in inscriptions that shone in the midday sun. "This is it," Maya announced, climbing down from her vehicle, her eyes wide with wonder. Sarah approached the inscriptions, her heart beating fast. The symbols were a mixture of cuneiform writing and something older, more primordial. Elizabeth immediately began photographing and documenting the inscriptions, while other women set up a security perimeter. Sarah took her great-grandmother's diary out of her backpack, comparing some of the symbols. "This is incredible," she muttered. "They're the same inscriptions mentioned in the diary." Rebecca discovered a narrow entrance between the rocks. The air coming out of the opening was surprisingly fresh and charged with that same scent of desert flowers. The marks on her wrists pulsed more intensely now, almost glowing in the sunlight. "We need to get inside," decided Sarah, lighting a flashlight. Elizabeth agreed, preparing her documentation equipment. A small group, including Rebecca and Maya, followed them into the cave. The interior was surprisingly elaborate, with corridors that seemed to have been carved by ancient hands. The walls were covered in paintings and inscriptions that told a story, the true story of Lilith, preserved through the millennia. "Look at this," Elizabeth called out, illuminating a particularly well-preserved panel. "This is the complete version of the story. Not just Lilith's rebellion, but what happened afterwards. The formation of the first societies of marked women, the rituals, the preserved knowledge." Sarah began to translate the inscriptions, her voice trembling with emotion. It wasn't just a rebellion against submission, she read. It was the beginning of a pact. Lilith promised that she would return when her daughters were ready to reclaim their power. A sudden wind blew through the corridors, blowing out some of the lanterns. The scent of flowers intensified, and the marks on her wrists began to glow with a light of their own, illuminating the walls of the cave. Maya let out an exclamation of surprise, pointing to a side chamber they hadn't noticed before. In the center of the circular space, there was an ancient altar with a carved symbol, 3 intertwined crescents, identical to the marks on her wrists. "The third seal," Sarah whispered, remembering her grandmother's words. She approached the altar, feeling an ancient and powerful energy emanating from the stone. The other women formed a circle around her, their marks glowing in unison. A distant sound of footsteps echoed through the corridors. The guardians had found the place. Quickly, Elizabeth urged, "We need to document everything before they arrive." Sarah placed her hands on the altar, and the inscriptions on the walls began to glow with a light of their own. Ancient images and knowledge flowed through her. Forgotten rituals, words of power, secrets kept by generations of marked women. "It's a code," Rebecca realized, frantically photographing the illuminated walls. "Each mark is a key. Each marked woman carries a piece of knowledge. Together, we form the complete puzzle." Footsteps approached. Elizabeth quickly organized the retreat, ensuring that all the evidence was documented. But Sarah remained a moment longer, her hands still on the altar. An ancient voice echoed in her mind. "The awakening is almost complete. Prepare for the last test." When the group emerged from the cave, the sun was setting, painting the desert in shades of red and gold. The Guardians of Silence were waiting for them, but they were not alone. Dozens of other marked women had arrived, forming a protective circle around the cave entrance. Sarah looked to the horizon, where more vehicles were approaching, bringing more marked women. Ancient knowledge pulsed through her veins, and she knew she was only witnessing the beginning of something much bigger. The real battle was about to begin. The tension was palpable as the two groups faced each other in the desert twilight. Sarah, still holding the newly acquired knowledge from the cave, felt the ancient power flowing through her. The marked women formed a protective semicircle, their marks glowing in unison under the darkening sky. The Guardians of Silence, led by a gray-haired man whom Sarah recognized as a member of the University Council, advanced a few steps. "You don't understand the forces you're playing with," he warned, his voice laden with authority. Elizabeth stepped forward, her years of academic experience evident in her posture. "On the contrary," she replied, "for the first time in millennia, we understand perfectly." The desert wind picked up, bringing with it the increasingly intense scent of night flowers. Rebecca quickly organized the transfer of documents and photographs to safe places, while Maya led a low chant that other women began to accompany. It was an ancient melody, words in a language that Sarah recognized from the text she had studied. The leader of the Guardians made a gesture, and his men pulled out objects that looked like ancient amulets. "These symbols have protected us for generations," he declared. "They were created to contain the power that you recklessly seek to unleash." Sarah felt a familiar presence. Her grandmother Hannah emerged from the crowd of scarred women, wearing the ancient necklace she had passed down to her granddaughter. "These amulets were stolen from us," she revealed, her voice carrying the weight of the story. "Just as they tried to steal our true history." The sky above them began to transform. Clouds formed in impossible patterns, and the moon, although not yet visible, was already casting an unearthly light over the desert. The inscriptions on the cave began to glow with renewed intensity. "The third seal has been broken," Sarah announced, finally understanding the full meaning of the prophecy. Knowledge can no longer be contained. The marks on her wrists now burned, not with pain, but with a power that seemed to connect all the women present. The Guardians tried to advance, but found they couldn't move. The women's chanting had created an invisible barrier, a physical manifestation of the power they had been denied for so long. Their leader stared in amazement at his amulets, which were beginning to disintegrate in his hands. "For thousands of years," Sarah began to speak, her voice carrying an authority that was not entirely her own. You have distorted our history. You've turned our quest for equality into a cautionary tale. You turned Lilith into a demon when she was our first teacher of freedom. Professor Cohen appeared unexpectedly, positioning himself between the two groups. There is a choice to be made here, he declared. Do we keep burying the truth, or do we finally allow it to come to light? The air was charged with energy as the first ray of moonlight touched the desert sands. In response, the women's marks began to emit a silvery light that connected with each other, forming a luminous web of shared power and knowledge. Maya let out a cry of surprise as ancient inscriptions began to appear in the air itself, floating like luminous text. The lost records, whispered Elizabeth, recognizing symbols she had studied for decades. They were never destroyed. They were waiting for the right moment to be revealed. The Guardians, realizing that they had lost their power, began to retreat. Their leader, however, remained. You don't understand, Sarah, he said, his voice now almost pleading. There are truths that can destroy the very foundations of our society. Perhaps, Sarah replied, some foundations need to be destroyed so that we can build something better in their place. Ancestral knowledge flowed through her, revealing not only the past, but also possibilities for the future. Emma approached Sarah, taking her hands. Together, grandmother and granddaughter began to recite ancient words that came naturally to their lips. Other women joined in, their voices rising in a chorus that made the earth itself vibrate. The night sky opened up completely, revealing an extraordinarily bright moon. And then, for a moment that seemed eternal, all those present saw a majestic figure against the sky, a woman with flaming hair and powerful wings, her smile both wild and wise. Lilith, Sarah whispered, realizing that the ancient prophecy was not about the return of a single figure, but about the awakening of the power they all shared. The luminous inscriptions began to merge with the women themselves, the ancient knowledge being absorbed not only into their minds, but into their very beings. Sarah understood that this was only the beginning. The real work was yet to come. What happens now? Asked Rebecca, still holding a camera that had documented everything. Sarah looked at the horizon, where the lights of other marked women kept coming into the desert. Now, she replied, we begin to retell our story, not as a warning, but as a promise of liberation. Dawn found the desert transformed. The Guardians had left, their amulets reduced to dust. The marked women remained, sharing stories and knowledge that had lain dormant for millennia. Sarah knew that her academic journey had turned into something much bigger. The awakening wasn't just about recovering a lost history. It was about creating a future where power didn't have to mean domination, where female strength could finally be expressed to the full. As the sun rose over the ancient desert, the marked women began their journey back to the modern world, carrying with them a truth that could no longer be silenced. The scent of desert flowers lingered in the air, a constant reminder that some stories, once awakened, would never sleep again. At the top of Mount Olympus, where the clouds eternally danced around the golden palaces of the gods, Zeus watched the earth with a mixture of fury and determination. Prometheus' theft of the sacred fire had shaken the divine order, and the king of the gods could not allow such an affront to go unanswered. His stormy eyes scanned the horizon as his mind devised the perfect plan for revenge. In his celestial forge, Hephaestus worked tirelessly, molding gold and clay with his deft hands. Golden sparks danced in the air as he shaped the most beautiful creature ever conceived. Pandora, the first mortal woman. Her face was as delicate as the finest porcelain, her hair as black as the deepest night. In her eyes bore the sparkle of curiosity that would be both her blessing and her curse. Aphrodite surrounded creation, giving her the gift of beauty and seduction, while Athena gifted her with intelligence and manual skills. Hermes, the messenger of the gods, whispered in her ears the gift of speech and the ability to weave words like silk. Each deity contributed a gift, making Pandora irresistible to mortal eyes. Meanwhile, On Earth, Epimetheus lived in peace with his brother Prometheus. Both were titans who had chosen to live among humans, helping them to prosper. Prometheus, after stealing the sacred fire, had become a hero among mortals, teaching them how to master flames, forge metals, and cook food. His act of rebellion against Zeus had changed life on Earth forever. Zeus, watching the humans' progress with disdain, was finalizing the preparations for his plan. An ebony box, adorned with intricate golden carvings, rested on his throne. Inside it, invisible to mortal eyes, stirred the most terrible afflictions ever known to mankind. The king of the gods smiled, knowing that his revenge would be much sweeter than any direct punishment. Pandora, newly created and curious about everything around her, was sent to Earth with specific instructions. She was to marry Epimetheus and never open the mysterious box she carried with her. Zeus knew that this prohibition would only increase her desire to discover what was inside. Curiosity was her deepest nature, woven into her very essence by the gods. On arriving on Earth, Pandora was greeted by Epimetheus with instant fascination. His brother Prometheus, more cautious, warned him about accepting gifts from the gods, especially Zeus. But Epimetheus, whose name means the one who thinks afterwards, didn't heed his brother's warnings. He was completely bewitched by Pandora's beauty and grace. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Pandora and Epimetheus lived in harmony, building a life together in their modest stone house. The mysterious box rested in a corner of the room, seemingly forgotten, but always present in Pandora's thoughts. At night, she could swear she heard whispers coming from it, tantalizing calls that penetrated her dreams. Life on Earth was simple, but rewarding. Humans, thanks to the fire stolen by Prometheus, developed rapidly. They learned how to work metal, build sturdier shelters, and defend themselves against wild beasts. They didn't know disease, they didn't age with suffering, and wars were foreign concepts to their pure hearts. Pandora watched everything with fascination, taking an active part in the life of the community. She taught the women to weave, talked to the men about philosophy, and played with the children. Her presence brought a new dimension of beauty and grace to the world of mortals. However, with each passing day, curiosity about the contents of the box grew in his heart like a persistent seed. One particularly silent night, while Epimetheus slept soundly, Pandora once again found herself in front of the mysterious box. The full moon cast its silvery glow through the window, making the golden carvings sparkle hypnotically. The whispers seemed stronger than ever, promising to reveal secrets beyond his imagination. His hands trembled as he touched the smooth surface of the box. What harm could there be in just a little peek, she thought to herself. Surely the gods wouldn't have entrusted me with something truly dangerous. Her fingers slid into the lock, hesitant but determined. The air around her seemed charged with electricity, as if the cosmos itself were holding its breath. On Olympus, Zeus watched with a satisfied smile, knowing that his plan was about to come to fruition. Revenge against Prometheus would be carried out through Pandora's delicate hands, and humanity would pay the price for its arrogance in defying the gods. The lock gave way with a soft click, and for a moment, everything remained absolutely silent. Pandora opened the lid just a crack, enough for a single gust of wind to escape, carrying with it the first of the evils that would forever change the fate of mankind. Without realizing it, she had started a chain of events that would irreversibly transform the world of mortals. Pandora watched in horror as dark and sinister shapes escaped from the box in an endless torrent. The first breath of wind turned into a deafening howl, and dark creatures representing every imaginable affliction spread across the world like an uncontrollable storm. Their eyes, wide with dread, witnessed the birth of every evil that now infected the earth. Diseases, represented by greenish, slimy shadows, snaked through the air, looking for hosts to infect. Old age manifested itself as a grayish mist that began to touch mortals, robbing them of their eternal youth. War emerged as bloodthirsty red specters, planting the first seeds of conflict in human hearts. Famine rose like a yellowish wind that withered crops and poisoned herds. Epimetheus woke up startled by the turmoil. When he saw his beloved Pandora standing by the open box, he instantly understood the magnitude of the catastrophe. "What have you done?" he whispered, his voice laced not with anger, but with deep sadness. Pandora, overcome with despair, struggled to close the lid of the box, while more and more evil escaped into the world. Outside the house, the first screams began to echo. The inhabitants of the village, once so peaceful and happy, felt the changes in their bodies and minds. Pains they had never experienced before struck them, while dark thoughts began to eat away at their souls. Humanity's innocence was being brutally ripped away, replaced by a new and terrible reality. On Olympus, Zeus watched his revenge unfold with cruel satisfaction. His eyes sparkled with each new suffering that spread across the earth. Knowing that Prometheus would be forced to witness the price of his rebellion through the suffering of those he had tried so hard to protect, Prometheus, still free at that moment, sensed the change in the air. The Titan who had stolen the god's fire to benefit humanity immediately realized that something terrible had happened. He ran towards his brother's house, his heart heavy with the foreboding of the disaster he would encounter. Pandora, in the midst of the chaos she had unleashed, struggled desperately with the box. Her tears fell onto the dark wood as she tried to contain what was left inside the cursed container. It was then that she noticed something different, a soft, golden light, unlike the dark shadows that had escaped, was still pulsating at the bottom of the box. Hope, the last entity trapped in the box, glowed serenely, waiting for her moment. Pandora, on an impulse, quickly closed the lid, keeping this last gift safe inside the box. Perhaps, she thought, in the midst of her despair, this last divine gift could somehow make up for the harm she had caused. The changes in the outside world were devastating. The sky, once always clear, began to be covered with dark clouds. The first signs of aging appeared on people's faces. Children began to fall ill, and disputes over previously abundant resources began to arise between neighbors who until then had lived in harmony. Prometheus arrived at his brother's house to find Pandora hugging the box, sobbing uncontrollably, while Epimetheus tried to console her. The Titan, with his ancient wisdom, immediately understood that this was Zeus' revenge, plotted not only against him, but against all of humanity. "My dear Pandora," said Prometheus softly, approaching the weeping woman, "don't blame yourself entirely. Zeus planned this from the start. Your curiosity was not just a personality trait, but a divine weapon, forged specifically for this moment." As they talked, the first rays of the rising sun seeped through the cracks in the house, illuminating the box that Pandora still held. The golden glow of hope, still imprisoned, seemed stronger in the daylight, as if to remind everyone of its presence. "Hope remains with us," remarked Epimetheus, noticing the glow. "Perhaps this is the true gift of the gods, not to torture us, but to give us the strength to face all the other evils that now afflict us." Pandora raised her eyes, still watery with tears, but with a new understanding dawning in her heart. Hope, kept safe inside the box, would be humanity's last resort, a comfort in the darkest moments to come. Outside, the world was continuing its transformation. The first conflicts were breaking out between communities. Disease was spreading rapidly, and famine was beginning to show its cruel face. However, in the midst of all this chaos, something unexpected began to happen. Humans, facing adversity for the first time, began to demonstrate surprising strength and resilience. Prometheus watched with a mixture of sadness and admiration as the mortals adapted to their new circumstances. The fire he had stolen for them became even more precious now, not just as a tool, but as a symbol of hope and progress. People gathered around the fires at night, sharing stories and mutual comfort, finding ways to survive and even thrive in the midst of adversity. News of the box's opening spread quickly among mortals, but instead of condemning Pandora, many began to see in her a reflection of their own nature, imperfect, curious, and capable of both mistakes and redemption. The story of the preserved hope became a symbol that, even in the darkest times, there was still light to be found. As the days turned into weeks, humanity began to adapt to its new reality. Pandora, still carrying the weight of her action, dedicated herself to helping those who suffered from the afflictions she had freed. Her house became a refuge for the sick and afflicted, where she shared words of comfort and stories about the hope she still held. Epimetheus, for his part, worked tirelessly to strengthen the community's defenses. With the emergence of the first territorial disputes, he had to teach the men the art of defensive warfare, a skill he had never imagined would be necessary in previous times. His heart was heavy when he saw how the people, once so united, now looked at each other with suspicion. Prometheus, foreseeing that Zeus' revenge was not complete, was preparing for his own fate. He knew that the king of the gods would not be satisfied with the suffering of mortals alone. During his waking nights, he shared his knowledge with the humans closest to him, teaching them not only about fire, but about medicine, agriculture, and the arts needed to survive the new times. The box, now kept on a specially built altar, emitted a soft, steady glow, hope pulsing inside. People came from far and wide to gaze at it, finding comfort in the golden light that escaped through its cracks. Pandora noticed that those who approached the box seemed to leave with a new vigor, as if the mere proximity to hope renewed their strength. In the land of mortals, the seasons began to change for the first time. Autumn arrived, bringing with it the first experience of scarcity that humanity would ever know. The trees, once evergreen and fruitful, lost their leaves. The fields, which had previously produced abundantly, began to show signs of exhaustion. Famine, one of the afflictions unleashed, began to show its cruelest face. In the midst of these changes, something unexpected began to happen. Humans, forced by necessity, began to develop new skills and technologies. The knowledge of fire, given to them by Prometheus, was expanded and improved. They learned how to store food, create more efficient tools, and build sturdier shelters. Adversity, although painful, was proving to be a driving force for progress. Pandora watched these transformations with a mixture of guilt and admiration. Each new achievement of humanity seemed like a small triumph over the evils it had unleashed. In her conversations with visitors, she began to realize that perhaps her action, although terrible, had forced humanity to evolve in ways that would not have been possible in its previous existence of pure simplicity. Zeus, from the heights of Olympus, watched the developments with growing irritation. The resilience of mortals surprised and annoyed him. He was even more disturbed by the fact that hope, which he had planned as the final blow, its absence should have been the real torment, remained with them, kept in the box by Pandora. It was then that the king of the gods decided to carry out the second part of his plan. On a particularly violent, stormy night, he sent his servants to capture Prometheus. The Titan, who had been waiting for this moment, did not resist. He was taken to Mount Caucasus, where he would be chained and condemned to eternal torment. An eagle would devour his liver every day, and because it was immortal, the organ would regenerate itself every night so that the ordeal could begin again. The news of Prometheus' punishment spread quickly among mortals, causing great consternation. Pandora felt the weight of her guilt increase, knowing that the Titan's suffering was directly linked to his weakness in the face of curiosity. Epimetheus, devastated by his brother's fate, spent days in silence, contemplating the flames that now seemed more like a painful reminder than a gift. However, even in this dark moment, something extraordinary happened. Instead of giving in to despair, humanity united in its shared pain. Stories about Prometheus' sacrifice began to be told around the campfires. His act of stealing fire and his punishment became symbols of resistance and hope. Pandora's box, containing the last and most precious of gifts, began to glow more brightly during these nocturnal gatherings. It was as if hope responded to the collective strength of mortals, feeding off their determination and giving them redoubled courage. Observing this phenomenon, Pandora began to understand something profound about the nature of hope. It wasn't just a passive force, waiting to comfort the afflicted, but an active energy that grew and strengthened with every act of resistance, every small victory over adversity that she herself had unleashed on the world. Communities began to organize themselves in new ways. Where once there had only been families living in natural harmony, more complex social structures now emerged. Leaders emerged, not through strength or fear, but through their ability to inspire and guide others through difficult times. Knowledge became a valuable currency, passed down from generation to generation with a new sense of urgency and purpose. Epimetheus, emerging from his mourning, took on an important role in this new order. His experiences, both the joy of his marriage to Pandora and the pain of losing his brother, had made him wise in a way that only suffering could teach. He began to advise the younger ones, teaching them to find a balance between caution and courage, between tradition and innovation. Pandora spent more and more time by the box, studying the glow of hope that pulsed inside. She noticed that the golden light seemed to respond to the emotions of the people around her, intensifying at times of greatest need. During the darkest nights, when illnesses seemed more severe or when hunger struck harder, the glow became more intense, as if it wanted to reach those who needed comfort the most. On one of these nights of contemplation, Pandora made a surprising discovery. While carefully observing the pattern of light, she noticed that tiny sparks occasionally escaped through the gaps in the box, floating like golden fireflies before dissolving into thin air. Each person touched by these sparks seemed renewed, as if a tiny seed of hope had been planted in their heart. This discovery led Pandora to a new understanding. Hope didn't have to be completely contained. It could be shared in small doses, nourishing the human spirit without running out. It was like the fire that Prometheus had stolen. A single flame could light thousands of torches without losing its own light. Meanwhile, humanity continued to adapt to adversity. The first cities began to emerge, with walls to protect against wars and warehouses to store food during periods of scarcity. Medical knowledge, initiated by Prometheus, expanded as people learned to fight the diseases that now afflicted them. Epimetheus, observing these changes, began to organize regular meetings where people could share their knowledge and experiences. These gatherings, always held around a central bonfire, became sacred moments of union and learning. Pandora's box was always brought to these gatherings, its soft glow illuminating the faces of the participants. At one of these gatherings, a young fisherman shared a story that captured everyone's attention. He spoke of seeing Prometheus in his dreams, still chained to Mount Caucasus, but smiling despite his torment. In the dream, the Titan had said that his true gift to humanity was not just fire, but the ability to turn adversity into progress. This story caused Pandora to reflect deeply. She began to realize that perhaps the evils she had unleashed were not just curses, but also catalysts for change. Disease had led to the development of medicine, famine to the evolution of agriculture, and even war had taught valuable lessons about unity and diplomacy. The seasons continued their cycle, bringing new challenges with each change. Winter, especially severe that year, forced communities to develop more efficient techniques for preserving food and building shelters. People learned to weave warmer clothes and conserve the heat of the fire in more efficient ways. In the midst of these adaptations, Pandora noticed something extraordinary. Some of the evils she had released seemed to be transforming. Not that they had disappeared, but humans were learning to find benefits even in adversity. Old age, for example, came to be seen not just as a burden, but as a source of wisdom and experience. One afternoon, while assisting a group of healers treating the sick, Pandora had an epiphany. She realized that her true redemption would not come from keeping hope in the box forever, but from learning to distribute it wisely. Just as Prometheus' fire had spread from torch to torch, perhaps hope could be shared from heart to heart. With this new understanding, Pandora began to develop a ritual. During evening gatherings, she would open the box just enough for a few sparks of hope to escape, dancing among those present like shooting stars. Each person touched by these sparks became a bearer of hope, capable of transmitting it to others through words and actions. Zeus, watching from Olympus, was intrigued by this unexpected development. His revenge had transformed the world in ways he had not foreseen. Humans, instead of succumbing to despair, were becoming stronger, more resilient, and in a way, closer to the gods themselves in their ability to face challenges and create solutions. Epimetheus, seeing his wife's work, felt his love for her grow even more. The woman who had been sent as an instrument of divine vengeance had become a source of healing and hope for humanity. Her act of keeping hope in the box, which had initially seemed a small consolation, was proving to be as significant as her brother's theft of the fire. Communities began to send messengers to each other, sharing not only resources and knowledge, but also stories of hope and overcoming. A network of solidarity began to form, connecting people who, despite distances and differences, faced the same challenges and dreamed the same dreams. Pandora's name, which had initially been associated with calamity, began to take on new meanings. People spoke of her not only as the one who had unleashed the evils of the world, but as the guardian of hope, the one who had learned to turn her mistake into a source of strength for all humanity. One particularly significant morning, Pandora woke up with a different feeling. The light of dawn came through the window of her house, illuminating the box that held hope. And for the first time since she had opened it, she didn't feel the crushing weight of guilt. Years had passed since that fateful night, and the world, although changed, was not as lost as she had first feared. Around her community, now a thriving city, evidence of adaptation and progress was visible everywhere. Hospitals had been built to treat the sick, complex irrigation systems guaranteed harvests even in difficult times, and schools passed on knowledge to new generations. Humanity had learned not only to survive, but to thrive in the face of adversity. Epimetheus, who was watching his wife contemplate the sunrise, noticed a change in her countenance. The years had left their mark on her face. Old age, one of the afflictions released, had not spared her, but her eyes retained a special sparkle, now mixed with the wisdom that only time could bring. During one of the evening meetings, an elder shared an observation that captured the essence of what they had experienced. The evils that escaped from the box were not only our curse, but our harshest teachers. Each challenge forced us to grow. Each pain taught us compassion. Each loss showed us the value of what we have. The elder's words resonated deeply with Pandora. She began to understand that perhaps this was the gods' real plan, not just to punish humanity, but to force it to evolve. The presence of evil in the world had created the necessary context for hope to become truly meaningful. Occasional news arrived about Prometheus, still chained to his rock. Travelers reported that despite his eternal torment, the Titan smiled when he saw the cities humans had built, the progress they had made. His sacrifice had not been in vain. The fire he had stolen had become much more than just a flame. On one special night, when the full moon bathed the earth in its silvery light, Pandora made a transformative decision. Gathering the whole community together, she explained that it was time for a change in the way they kept hope. The box, which for so long had been kept closed with only tiny sparks escaping, needed to be rethought in its purpose. Hope, she explained, is not like the other evils that have escaped. It doesn't run out when it's shared. On the contrary, it multiplies. Each person who carries hope in their heart becomes a source of it for others. Maybe it's time we trusted this truth more. With careful and deliberate gestures, Pandora began a new ritual. Instead of allowing only small sparks to escape, she opened the box completely. The golden glow of hope flooded the night, stronger than any fire, brighter than any star. But contrary to what many had feared, hope did not disperse as the other evils had done. Instead, the golden light danced among the people present, touching each of them before returning to the box, as if establishing a permanent connection. It was as if hope had created an invisible network, connecting all human hearts to their original source. This moment marked the beginning of a new era. The box would remain open, no longer as a sealed receptacle, but as a constant beacon. People learned that they could approach it freely, renew their strength, and set off again, taking with them not just the memory of the light, but its living essence. Zeus, watching from Olympus, finally understood something he hadn't anticipated. His revenge, designed to punish Prometheus and humanity, had inadvertently created something stronger than any divine power. A humanity that not only hoped for better days, but actively worked to create them. Epimetheus, who had always carried the weight of not having been cautious enough in accepting Pandora as his wife, now saw his decision in a new light. What had seemed like a weakness had turned out to be a strength. His ability to love and trust, even in the face of the unknown, had allowed hope to find her true purpose among mortals. The following generations would grow up hearing the story not only of the evils Pandora unleashed, but of the wisdom with which she guarded and then shared hope. Her story would become a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there is always the possibility of transformation and renewal. And so, what began as divine vengeance turned into an unexpected gift. The evils that escaped from the gods would continue to challenge humanity, but now there was a balance. Hope, no longer a prisoner but a partner, shown as a constant reminder that true power lies not in avoiding difficulties, but in finding the strength to overcome them. Pandora, observing the legacy she had inadvertently created, finally found peace. Her curiosity, which Zeus had planned as a weapon, had become a catalyst for the growth and evolution of humanity. In her mistake, she had discovered a profound truth, that sometimes it is precisely through our failures that we find our greatest gifts. The wind howled through the concrete pillars of the old Miller Bridge, a weathered structure that stretched over the Blackwater River in Cedar Grove, a small town in rural Michigan. Sarah Mitchell, a 28-year-old investigative journalist, adjusted the rearview mirror of her Honda Civic as she parked near the entrance to the bridge. The digital clock on the dashboard read 23:45, and she could feel her heart racing as the minutes approached midnight. It wasn't the first time Sarah had investigated urban legends. It was her specialty at the local Cedar Grove Gazette. But there was something different about this particular story. Over the past few months, several residents had reported disturbing experiences on the bridge, all following a similar pattern. The cry of a baby at midnight, followed by mysterious knocks on vehicles. Sarah opened her notebook and reread her notes. The story dated back to 1987, when a young mother called Elizabeth Cooper, aged just 19, allegedly threw a newborn baby off the bridge. The body was never found, and Elizabeth disappeared soon after, leaving only speculation and an urban legend that persisted for more than 3 decades. "You shouldn't be here alone," the deep voice made Sarah jump in her seat. Through the car window, she recognized Officer Mike Thompson, a veteran police officer who had been patrolling the area for over 20 years. He was one of the first sources she had interviewed about the legend. "Mike, you scared me." Sarah rolled down her window, feeling the cold October night air invade the car. "I'm just doing my job." "I know you are, but this bridge has a strange energy, especially at night." Mike leaned on the car window, his experienced eyes scanning the shadowy structure ahead. "I've seen things here that I can't explain." Sarah knew that look well. It was the same one she had noticed in all her interviewees when they mentioned their experiences on the bridge. "What exactly did you see, Mike?" The policeman hesitated, running his hand through his gray hair. "It was about 15 years ago. I was doing my usual rounds when I heard, well, you know, the crying. I thought it was just the wind, but then I saw a woman in a white dress in the middle of the bridge. When I turned on the siren, she just disappeared." Sarah quickly typed Mike's words into her notebook. During her investigation, she had collected dozens of similar reports, but something still didn't add up. Why now, after so long, with the incidents intensifying? "There's something else you should know," Mike continued, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "Last week, we found something during a routine dredging of the river. It was an old hospital bag dating back to 1987. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. From the same time as exactly Mike confirmed. And there was a name written on it, Elizabeth Cooper. Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine. Her previous investigations had revealed very little about Elizabeth. It was as if the young mother had been erased from the town's history. No school records, no known relatives, just a few sparse mentions in old newspapers. Have you managed to find out anything else about her? Sarah asked, adjusting her scarf against the growing chill. Actually, yes. I've been going through old files from the police station and found something interesting. Elizabeth wasn't alone that night. There was a record of an emergency call minutes before the incident. A witness reported seeing two men chasing a woman with a baby towards the bridge. This was new information, something that completely changed the perspective of the story. Sarah looked at her watch. 11:55 p.m. Mike, I have to stay. I have to see for myself. The policeman sighed, clearly worried. I can't stop you, but be careful. Some stories are best left alone. He walked away from the car, but stopped and turned around. Oh, and Sarah, if you hear her crying, don't turn your headlights off. Never turn your headlights off. Sarah watched through the rearview mirror as Mike's car disappeared into the darkness. Alone again, she began to feel the weight of the silence that preceded midnight. The bridge seemed different now, more threatening, as if it held secrets that preferred to remain in the shadows. Her fingers drummed nervously on the steering wheel as she considered the new information. If Elizabeth was being stalked that night, that changed everything. It was no longer just a story of tragedy and despair, but possibly something more sinister, a crime covered up by decades of superstition and fear. The clock struck 23:59, and Sarah could swear that the temperature inside the car had dropped a few degrees. Her eyes alternated between the dark bridge in front of her and the digital clock on the dashboard, counting down the seconds to midnight. Mike's words echoed in her mind. Never turn off your headlights. But Sarah knew that to find out the truth, she had to do just that. After all, it wasn't just a story that needed to be told. It was an injustice that needed to be revealed. And as the clock approached midnight, she knew one thing for sure. The real story of Miller Bridge was only just beginning to unfold. At midnight sharp, Sarah gripped the steering wheel tightly, her eyes fixed on the darkness ahead. The silence was absolute, except for the gentle hum of her Honda Civic's engine. Her fingers hovered over the headlight switch, Mike's warning still echoing in her mind. Just a few minutes, she muttered to herself, trying to calm her nerves. With one swift movement, she switched off the headlights, plunging the bridge in complete darkness. The weak moonlight barely illuminated the contours of the ancient structure. The first few minutes were silent. Sarah kept her eyes peeled, alternating between watching the bridge through the windshield and checking the notes in her notebook. The wind began to pick up, whistling through the bridge's metal beams, creating an eerie melody that made her heart race. It was then that she heard it. At first, it was almost imperceptible, a sound so soft that it could easily be mistaken for the wind. But gradually it became more distinct, the unmistakable cry of a baby. Sarah picked up her digital recorder with trembling hands, making sure she was picking up the sound. The cry intensified, echoing through the bridge structure. It was an agonizing sound, full of despair and pain. Suddenly, a loud bang on the side of the car made her jump. Sarah stifled a scream, her fingers instinctively reaching for the headlight switch. But before she could reach it, something caught her eye in the rear view mirror, a pale figure in the middle of the bridge. It was a young woman dressed in white, exactly as Mike had described. Her dress fluttered in the night wind, and her long dark hair partially covered her face. She seemed to be looking for something. Her movements were erratic and desperate. Sarah picked up her camera, but her hands were shaking so badly that she could barely focus it. The figure began to move towards the car, each step echoing off the metal structure of the bridge. The baby's crying increased in intensity, now mixed with feminine sobs. "Elizabeth," Sarah whispered, although she knew it was irrational to try to communicate with an apparition. The banging on the car started again, louder this time, coming from all sides. Sarah finally turned on the headlights, but the figure had disappeared. The crying stopped abruptly, leaving only the sound of the wind and her own racing heart. With trembling hands, she started the car and drove quickly off the bridge. She parked in a safe area and took a deep breath, trying to process what had just happened. Her tape recorder was still on, and she rewound it to listen to the recording. To her surprise, in addition to the baby's cries and the knocks, there was something else, a female voice, almost inaudible, repeating words she couldn't clearly make out. Sarah connected the recorder to her laptop and used an audio program to clean up the background noise. While she was working on the recording, her cell phone vibrated. A message from Mike. "I found more information about Elizabeth. We need to talk. It's urgent." Sarah replied immediately, arranging to meet first thing the next morning at the local cafe. Meanwhile, she continued working on the recording, turning up the volume and filtering the frequencies until the words began to make sense. "They've taken my baby, please." Help, a shiver ran down her spine. The voice was clear now, full of anguish and fear. Sarah went back to her notes about the night Elizabeth disappeared. The two men the witness had seen. Who were they? And why were they chasing a young mother and her baby? Her phone vibrated again. Another message from Mike. "Be careful who you trust. Some people in Cedar Grove don't want this story to come out." The warning made Sarah reflect on how much bigger this story could be than a simple urban legend. If Elizabeth really had been stalked, if her baby had been taken from her by force, then what happened on Miller Bridge in 1987 wasn't an act of desperation by a young mother. It was something much darker. Sarah spent the next few hours organizing her notes and evidence. The recording of the crying, the apparition of the woman in white, the voice calling for help. Everything pointed to a truth that had been buried by decades of silence and superstition. As the sun began to rise, Sarah had a new theory forming in her mind. Elizabeth Cooper's story wasn't just about a personal tragedy. It was about a crime that had been covered up and turned into an urban legend to keep people away from the truth. But now, more than 3 decades later, the secrets of Miller Bridge were beginning to come to light. And Sarah was determined to find out what really happened on that fateful night in 1987. No matter how many people in Cedar Grove wanted to keep the past buried. With her camera, recorder, and notebooks safely tucked away, she drove home, her mind filled with unanswered questions. Meeting Mike the next morning could provide more pieces to this puzzle. But Sarah had a feeling that the closer she got to the truth, the more dangerous her investigation would become. The morning sun was shining on Cedar Grove when Sarah finally arrived home, but the shadows of the night before still loomed large in her mind. The true story of Miller Bridge and Elizabeth Cooper was just beginning to unfold, and she knew there would be no turning back now. The soft light of dawn came through the windows of the Cedar Grove Cafe when Sarah found Mike at a discreet table at the back of the establishment. She hadn't slept, having spent the entire night analyzing the recording and organizing her notes. The policeman looked equally tired, with deep circles under his eyes. "I found something in the old files at the police station," Mike said quietly as soon as Sarah sat down. In 1987, there were a series of baby disappearances from hospitals in the area. They were all filed as unrelated cases, but there was a pattern. All the mothers were young and unmarried. Sarah felt her stomach turn. "Do you think Elizabeth was connected to these cases?" "I'm sure." Mike slid a yellowed folder across the table. Elizabeth worked as a nursing assistant at Cedar Grove Memorial Hospital. In the weeks before her disappearance, she had registered several complaints about irregular procedures in the nursery. Sarah flipped through the documents with trembling hands. Elizabeth's complaints mentioned a doctor, Dr. James Harrison, and a nurse called Robert Wells. Both worked the night shift and, coincidentally, left the hospital shortly after the incident on the bridge. "The witness who saw the two men chasing Elizabeth," Sarah began. "She was never officially interviewed," Mike added. "The report was filed by the chief detective at the time, Thomas Blackwood." "Blackwood?" Sarah frowned. "As in Richard Blackwood, the Kerr mayor?" "His father," Mike confirmed. "And guess who was the main donor to the hospital back then?" "The Blackwood family." The waitress approached to take their orders, causing them both to fall silent momentarily. After ordering their coffee, Sarah leaned forward. "So we have a baby trafficking scheme involving the hospital, a whistleblower who has been silenced, and a powerful family potentially involved in the cover-up. It's worse." Mike lowered his voice even more. "Last night, after I left you on the bridge, I received an anonymous phone call. The person said that Elizabeth didn't throw her baby. She was trying to save it. Apparently, she found out where the babies were being taken and tried to expose the scheme." Sarah felt a chill. The voice on the recording made more sense now. "They took my baby, Sarah," Mike continued, his tone grave. The person who called me said that she worked at the hospital at the time. She claimed that Dr. Harrison and Wells weren't just employees. They were part of a network that sold babies to wealthy families all over the country. Why is this person talking now, after all this time? Guilt maybe, but there's more. She mentioned that there are records, documents that Elizabeth had gathered. Supposedly, she hid them somewhere near the bridge before. Mike was interrupted by the sound of his police radio. A crackly voice was informing him of a fire in the police station's archive. He stood up abruptly. "This is no coincidence," he said, throwing some notes on the table. "Someone is trying to cover their tracks. Be careful, Sarah. Don't trust anyone." After Mike's hasty departure, Sarah remained in the cafe, her coffee cooling untouched as she processed the information. Her mind went back to the apparition on the bridge. It wasn't a vengeful spirit, but a desperate mother trying to tell her story. Determined, she paid her bill and drove to the municipal library. If Elizabeth had found out anything about the scam, there might be clues in the newspapers of the time. In the old periodical section, Sarah found something intriguing. A series of coded classified ads that appeared regularly in 1987, always following the same pattern. Loving families seeking special blessings. Discretion guaranteed. While photographing the ads, Sarah noticed a man watching her from between the shelves. When their gazes met, he quickly disappeared. Putting away her equipment, she decided it was time to visit someone who might have answers. The former librarian, Martha Jenkins, who had worked there since the 80s. Martha lived in a small house on the outskirts of town. When Sarah explained the reason for her visit, the elderly woman became visibly upset. Elizabeth used to spend hours here, Martha revealed, pouring tea with trembling hands. She would look through old newspapers, make notes. One day, she was so agitated that she forgot her notebook. When I went back to return it, she had already, do you still have that notebook? Martha hesitated. I tried to give it to the police, but Detective Blackwood said it wasn't relevant to the case. So I kept it, hoping that one day someone would ask the right questions. The old woman disappeared into a room and returned with a dusty box. Inside was a battered notebook, its pages yellowed by time. Sarah felt her heart race as she opened the first page and saw Elizabeth's hurried handwriting. "They're selling our babies. I have proof. I need to expose this before." The sentence ended abruptly. The following pages were full of names, dates, and codes that Sarah would have to decipher. But a note near the end caught her eye. "Secure documents. Third pillar. Do not trust the police." The third pillar of Miller Bridge. Sarah looked at her watch. There was still a few hours until nightfall. If the documents Elizabeth had hidden were still there, they could finally reveal the truth about what happened on that fateful night in 1987. But as she thanked Martha and prepared to leave, Sarah didn't notice the dark car parked across the street, nor the man inside it making a phone call. She found the notebook. "Yes, sir. Got it." The truth about the Miller Bridge was about to come out, but some people in Cedar Grove would do anything to keep it in the shadows. Sarah drove hurriedly towards the Miller Bridge, her mind processing everything she had discovered. Elizabeth's notebook weighed on her purse like a silent testimony to the dark secrets of Cedar Grove. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky with orange hues that reflected off the dark waters of the Blackwater River. Before reaching the bridge, she stopped at a gas station to fill up and buy a new flashlight. While waiting in line at the cashier, she noticed a local newspaper with a headline that made her blood run cold. "Fire at police station destroys historical archives." The photo showed Mike Thompson among the firefighters, his face tense as he supervised the operation. His phone vibrated, a message from an unknown number. "Meet me at the abandoned cafe near the bridge. I have information about Elizabeth. Come alone." Sarah hesitated, aware of the risks, but the possibility of finding out more about the case was too tempting to ignore. The abandoned cafe was a decaying structure about half a kilometer from the bridge. When Sarah arrived, she found Martha Jenkins waiting in the empty parking lot, looking even more nervous than before. "Sorry about the anonymous message," said Martha, looking around constantly. "After you left, I remembered something important. Elizabeth wasn't pregnant when she started investigating the disappearances. She was investigating because her younger sister, Amy, had a baby taken from her in hospital. Elizabeth had a sister? Sarah asked, surprised that this information had never appeared in her research. They had erased all of Amy's records, Martha explained. She was underage at the time. The Blackwood family made sure the case was completely covered up. But Elizabeth didn't give up. She kept investigating until she discovered that it wasn't an isolated case. A sudden noise startled the two women. Martha grabbed Sarah's arm. "There's one more thing. Dr. Harrison didn't leave town after the incident. He just changed his name and continued practicing in a private clinic. His new name is..." The sound of screeching tires interrupted the sentence. A dark car came out of nowhere, its headlights blinding. Martha pushed Sarah behind a dumpster seconds before gunshots echoed through the empty parking lot. Sarah remained motionless, her heart hammering as she heard the car accelerate and disappear into the night. When she finally dared to move, she found Martha lying on the ground, blood staining her blue sweater. "Martha!" Sarah knelt beside the elderly woman, her hands shaking as she dialed emergency. "The documents," Martha whispered with difficulty. "The Elizabeth, third pillar, old safe." Sirens began to sound in the distance as Martha lost consciousness. Sarah stayed with her until the ambulance arrived, her world spinning with the implications of what had happened. This was no longer just a journalistic investigation. It was a matter of life and death. After Martha was taken to hospital, Sarah found herself in a dilemma. The police would certainly want to question her, but every minute lost was one less chance of finding the documents before others did. With a sudden decision, she got into her car and drove to the bridge. Dusk had given way to full night when she parked next to the structure. Armed with her new flashlight and Elizabeth's notebook, Sarah started down the steep slope towards the third pillar. The river flowed violently below, its black waters holding decades of secrets. Following the cryptic instructions in the notebook, Sarah carefully examined the pillar. After several minutes of searching, her fingers found an irregularity in the concrete. A small, cleverly camouflaged compartment. Inside, protected by waterproof plastic, was a yellowed envelope. The sound of footsteps on the bridge above made her hide closer to the pillar. Male voices conversed in low tones, and the beam of flashlights swept the area. "Are you sure she come here?" a voice asked. "Old Mike said she was investigating the history of the bridge," another voice replied. "If she found Elizabeth's notebook, she'll be looking for the documents." Sarah recognized the second voice. It belonged to Richard Blackwood, the current mayor. Her heart raced as she realized that she was effectively trapped between the river and her pursuers. Careful not to make a sound, she tucked the envelope in her jacket and began to move sideways along the base of the bridge, using the shadows as cover. Her foot slipped on a loose stone, causing a small gravel slide. "Did you hear that?" one of the voices asked. Sarah froze, pressed against the cold concrete, as the beams of the lanterns danced ever closer to her position. It was then that she heard, faint at first but gradually growing, the cry of a baby. The men on the bridge heard it too. "What the hell is that?" A pale figure began to materialize in the middle of the bridge, just as Sarah had seen the night before. But this time, Elizabeth wasn't alone. Next to her, the translucent form of a younger girl also appeared. "Amy," Sarah whispered, finally realizing the true extent of the tragedy. The men on the bridge began to retreat, their hurried footsteps echoing off the metal structure. Sarah took advantage of the distraction to move quickly along the riverbank, her heart beating so hard it felt like it was going to explode. When she finally reached her car, her hands were shaking so badly that she could barely insert the key into the ignition. The envelope weighed heavily in her pocket, carrying with it the truth that it cost the lives of two sisters and now threatened to claim more victims. Sarah drove straight to Mike's apartment, knowing she couldn't trust anyone else. She found the policeman on his balcony, a grave expression on his face as he held up a phone. "Martha didn't resist her injuries," he said as soon as Sarah got out of the car. "We need to get you out of town. Now." "Not without exposing the truth first," Sarah replied, showing him the envelope. "I found Elizabeth's documents." Inside the apartment, they spread out the contents of the envelope on the kitchen table. There were old photos from the hospital, altered birth records, and a detailed list of adopted babies with amounts paid. Most disturbing was a set of photographs showing Dr. Harrison, now known as Dr. Malcolm Rivers, with prominent members of Cedar Grove Society, including the Blackwood family. That explains why the scheme continued even after Elizabeth, Mike muttered, examining the documents. It wasn't just about selling babies. It was about power and influence. Sarah began scanning each document with her cell phone, sending the images to a secure server. Elizabeth discovered that her sister Amy wasn't the only one. They had a whole system, Mike. Doctors, nurses, social workers. A noise outside made them both freeze. Mike drew his gun and approached the window. Cars approaching. Lots of them. How much time do we have? Not long. They must have tracked your car. Sarah finished scanning the last document and sent everything to her editor with an urgent message. Then she began drafting an email to all the main news agencies in the state. Sarah, Mike called out from the window, his voice tense. It's them. Richard Blackwood is here with the chief of police. How do they know? Sarah stopped when she saw Mike's guilty expression. You called them? I'm sorry, he said, lowering the gun. They have my family. The sound of doors opening and closing echoed outside. Sarah quickly pressed send on her phone and put it away. The original documents she stuffed into her boot. Mike, you don't have to do this, she tried, but the policeman had already opened the door. Richard Blackwood entered first, followed by two men Sarah recognized from the photos, Dr. Rivers and Robert Wells, older but still intimidating. Miss Mitchell, Blackwood smiled, the smile that didn't reach his eyes. I believe you have something that belongs to us. All I have is proof of your crimes, Sarah replied, keeping her voice steady despite her fear. And now the whole world is going to know. Do you really think anyone will believe you? Wells laughed. An obsessive journalist investigating urban legends? Please. A high-pitched scream cut through the air. A baby's cry. Everyone in the room froze. The temperature dropped dramatically, and a mist began to form in the center of the room. Elizabeth and Amy appeared, their ethereal forms more solid than ever. Behind them, other figures began to materialize. Dozens of young women, all carrying babies, their expressions a mixture of pain and accusation. Impossible, Dr. Rivers whispered, stepping back. The lights began to flicker, and objects around the room began to shake. Sarah took advantage of the distraction to run towards the back door, but Blackwood grabbed her. You're not going anywhere, he growled, but his grip loosened as an invisible force threw him against the wall. Chaos ensued. The spectral figures surged forward, their voices joining in a chorus of wails that made the windows vibrate. Wells tried to draw a gun, but it flew out of his hand. Dr. Rivers fell to his knees, covering his ears. Mike, who had been watching paralyzed, finally acted. Sarah run. She didn't have to listen twice. She burst through the back door and ran into the night, the sound of wailing following her. Sirens began to sound in the distance. Apparently, someone had called for reinforcements. When Sarah finally stopped, she was back at Miller Bridge. Gasping, she checked her phone. The messages and documents had been delivered. Within minutes, the story would be on all the major media outlets. A gentle touch on her shoulder made her turn around. Elizabeth was there, clearer than ever, Amy by her side. For the first time, Sarah could see their faces clearly. So young, so determined. Thank you, Elizabeth said, her voice like a whisper on the wind. Now they'll know the truth. The two sisters began to disappear, their forms dissolving into the night breeze. The baby's cry, which had been a constant on the bridge for so many years, finally fell silent. The next morning, Cedar Grove awoke to a media storm. The arrests of Richard Blackwood, Dr. Malcolm Rivers, and Robert Wells dominated the headlines. Former adoptions were investigated, families were located, and decades of secrets came to light. Sarah wrote the full story, not just about a criminal scheme, but about two sisters who refused to be silenced, even after death. The Miller Bridge stood as a silent reminder, but the baby's cry was never heard again. Mike, after confessing his forced involvement, cooperated with the authorities and helped dismantle what was left of the network. His family was found safe. Years later, a plaque was placed at the entrance to the bridge, in memory of Elizabeth and Amy Cooper and all the mothers and babies of Cedar Grove. At night, it is said that two figures can be seen walking across the bridge, no longer searching or lamenting, but at peace, finally free to tell their story. The sun was setting over the horizon of Athens, painting the sky with shades of orange and red reminiscent of spilled blood. Theseus, son of the Aegean king, watched from the palace balcony as young people wept in the embrace of their families. It was time for the terrible tribute that Athens owed Crete. 7 boys and 7 girls were to be sent to the labyrinth of the Minotaur. This cruel tradition had its origins in an ancient war between the two kingdoms. After the death of his son Androgeus on Athenian soil, King Minos of Crete, overcome by fury and the power of his superior army, imposed this punishment on the city. Every 9 years, 14 young men would be sacrificed to feed the monstrous Minotaur, the fruit of the unnatural union between Queen Pasiphae and a magnificent white bull sent by Poseidon. Theseus felt the weight of responsibility on his young but strong shoulders. Ever since he was a boy, he had heard stories about the labyrinth built by the genius Daedalus, a prison so complex that no human being had ever been able to find their way out after entering its winding corridors. The prince ran a hand through his dark hair, pensive, as he watched the movement in the harbor, where a black ship with sails of the same color awaited its human cargo. "My son," the deep voice of King Aegeus sounded behind him. "You don't have to do that. We've already lost too many young men to that freak." The old king put his hand on his son's shoulder, his eyes full of concern. Theseus turned to face him, determination shining in his gaze. "That's precisely why, father. I must go. I can't stand by while our people suffer. I am the Prince of Athens, and it is my duty to protect our citizens." His voice was firm but gentle. "Besides, I've been trained by the best warriors. If anyone stands a chance against the Minotaur, it's me." The king sighed heavily, knowing he wouldn't be able to dissuade his stubborn son. "Then take this," he said, removing a ruby ring from his finger, "so that you remember your home and your duty to return." The next morning, the port was packed, families said goodbye, mothers hugged their children as if their lives depended on it, and fathers tried to keep their composure while silent tears streamed down their wrinkled cheeks. Theseus voluntarily came forward as one of the 7 boys, causing a stir among the people watching. The ship set sail under a cloudy sky, as if the gods themselves shared in the Athenian morning. During the voyage, Theseus met his companions in misfortune. There was Callias, a young scribe who kept scribbling on a small piece of parchment as if he wanted to record every moment of his last days. Helen, a golden-haired girl who sang sad songs to calm the others. Pericles, a strong young man who had been drawn despite the protests of his pregnant fiancée. As they approached Crete, the fear in the young men's eyes grew. Some prayed to the gods, others simply remained silent, gazing at the horizon as if searching for answers in the waves of the sea. Theseus spent his time planning, observing and mentally preparing himself for what was to come. After 3 days of travel, Crete appeared on the horizon like a sleeping giant over the sea. The palace of Knossos, the seat of power of King Minos, was an imposing construction that seemed to defy the mountains themselves. Its multiple floors and terraces rose towards the sky, and its walls were decorated with colorful frescoes that told stories of glory and power. When the ship docked, Cretan guards escorted them through the harbor to the palace. It was then that Theseus saw her for the first time. Ariadne, the princess of Crete, was watching the Athenians arrive from one of the palace balconies. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and something inexplicable passed between them, an instant connection that made the prince's heart race. King Minos welcomed them into his throne room, an imposing man with a golden crown and eyes as cold as the sea in a storm. Beside him, Queen Pasiphae kept her gaze downcast, bearing the weight of shame for the monstrous son she had borne. Ariadne was there too, closer now, and Theseus could see the compassion in her dark eyes. "Welcome, Athenians," King Minos' voice echoed through the hall with a false cordiality. "Tomorrow at dawn, you will fulfill your destiny in the labyrinth. Tonight, Rest and enjoy our hospitality. It will be your last meal." During the forced banquet that followed, Theseus noticed the furtive glances Ariadne cast at him. The princess seemed restless, as if she wanted to say something, but the dozens of watchful eyes of the guards and courtiers made any communication impossible. That night, in his temporary quarters, Theseus couldn't sleep. The distant sound of the sea mixed with the muffled sobs coming from the other young men's rooms. He thought of his father, of Athens, of the monster he would have to face, and of Ariadne, whose mysterious eyes never left his mind. Then he heard a soft knock on his door. When he opened it, he found a servant who, without saying a word, handed him a small package and disappeared into the shadows of the corridor. Inside the package was a skein of golden thread that shone in the moonlight and a note written in delicate handwriting. "Meet me in the fountain garden at midnight." Theseus' heart raced. He knew that this could be both a trap and his only hope of survival. But something deep inside him told him that he could trust Ariadne. Stowing the golden bowl in his tunic, he prepared himself for an encounter that would change not only his fate, but that of all Athenians. Shadows danced through the palace corridors as Theseus moved silently towards the gardens. The full moon illuminated his path across the elaborate mosaics of the floor, each step calculated to avoid the watchful eye of the guards patrolling the corridors. The golden bowl weighed down his tunic, constantly reminding him of the mystery that awaited him. The fountain garden was a place of rare beauty. Even at night, crystal clear water gushed from a statue of Poseidon, and the soft sound created a natural curtain that could cover up whispered conversations. Theseus found Ariadne already waiting for him, her graceful silhouette cut out against the silvery moonlight. She wore a dark blue cloak that blended in with the shadows, her black hair tied up in an elaborate braid. "You've come," she whispered, her eyes shining with a mixture of relief and apprehension. "We only have a short time. The guards will be changing shifts soon." "Why are you helping me?" Theseus asked, keeping a respectful distance, but unable to hide his curiosity. Ariadne approached, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm tired of seeing innocent young people die because of cruel punishment. What my father is doing, it's not justice, it's revenge. And the Minotaur," she hesitated, "that creature shouldn't exist. It's an abomination born of pride and shame." She quickly explained about the golden thread, a special creation of Daedalus, the same architect who had built the labyrinth. "The thread is enchanted," she said. "It never breaks and always shows the way back. Tie it at the entrance and unwind it as you go. But remember, the labyrinth isn't just a set of corridors. It changes, it moves, it tries to confuse the mind." Theseus held the bowl tighter, feeling its peculiar warmth. "How can I be sure this isn't a trap?" "You can't," Ariadne answered honestly. "But if I wanted you dead, I just have to wait until tomorrow." Her eyes filled with restrained tears. "There's something else you need to know about the Minotaur. He's not just strong, he's intelligent. My half-brother," her voice faltered, "he understands our language. He can think like a man, but the fury of the bull dominates him. Years of isolation have made him more monster than human." A distant noise startled them both. Footsteps of guards were approaching. Ariadne quickly took something from her robes, a small bronze dagger with engraved symbols. This blade was blessed by priestesses. It may not be enough to kill the Minotaur, but it will help you defend yourself. Theseus accepted the weapon, feeling its comforting weight. "Why are you risking so much for me?" "Because I saw something in your eyes that was different from the others," she replied, her cheeks blushing slightly. "I saw hope, not just fear. And maybe," she hesitated, "maybe you're the one who could put an end to all this suffering." The footsteps came closer and closer. Ariadne cast an anxious glance down the corridor. "There's one more thing," she whispered hurriedly. "If you succeed, when you defeat the Minotaur, take me with you. I can no longer live in this palace of lies and cruelty." Before Theseus could reply, she quickly leaned over and kissed his cheek, a touch as soft as butterfly wings. The next moment, she had disappeared into the shadows of the garden, leaving only the scent of night flowers in the air. Theseus returned to his chambers with his mind in turmoil. The golden bowl and dagger hidden in his tunic seemed to burn against his skin, physical reminders of the pact he had just made. His initial plan to confront the Minotaur had turned into something much more complex. Now it was not only his life and that of the young Athenians at stake, but also the future of a princess who was risking everything to help him. Lying on his bed, looking up at the ceiling decorated with paintings of maritime scenes, Theseus planned every step of the next day. His father's ring shone on his finger, reminding him of his promise to return. Ariadne's dagger was hidden in his robes, along with the bowl of yarn that could mean the difference between life and death in the labyrinth. The first rays of the sun were beginning to tint the horizon when Theseus finally managed to sleep, his dreams populated by endless corridors, dark, compassionate eyes, and the menacing shadow of a half-man, half-bull creature. The weight of responsibility had never been so great, but he had never felt so prepared to face it. Dawn brought with it the sound of trumpets announcing the start of the ritual. The guards came to collect the young Athenians, who were taken to a courtyard where priests performed the last blessings. Theseus watched his companions, some weeping silently, others maintaining a stoic dignity in the face of the fate that awaited them. At the top of a staircase, King Minos presided over the ceremony with a cruel smile on his lips. Beside him, Ariadne kept her face impassive, but her eyes met those of Theseus for a brief moment, conveying a silent message of hope and determination. Queen Pasiphae was not present, as she always was on these occasions, unable to witness the terrible fate of the young victims. As the guards led them towards the entrance to the labyrinth, Theseus felt the weight of the golden bowl against his chest and the cold touch of the dagger hidden in his robes. The moment of truth was approaching, and with it, the chance to change the fate not only of Athens, but also of Crete. The entrance to the labyrinth revealed itself as an immense bronze door, its jambs decorated with reliefs that told stories of horror and suffering. The air emanating from the darkness beyond was cold and laden with an ancient smell, a mixture of mold and something more sinister that Theseus couldn't identify. The priest chanted darkly as the 14 young men were lined up in front of the entrance. Theseus noticed that his hands were trembling slightly as he discreetly tied the end of the golden thread to a small iron ring near the entrance. He made sure the knot was tight, remembering Ariadne's words about the enchantment of the thread. "May the gods have mercy on their souls," declared the high priest, his voice echoing through the stone courtyard. At his signal, the guards began to push the young men into the labyrinth. Theseus entered last, taking one last look at the open sky. He saw Ariadne on the balcony, her tiny figure against the grandeur of the palace. She put her hand to her chest in a gesture that only he would understand, where the dagger was hidden in her own clothes. The darkness swallowed them up quickly. The sound of the bronze door closing behind them echoed like a final sentence. Some of the young people began to cry. Others hugged each other in search of comfort. Torches on the walls lit up automatically, revealing corridors stretching out in all directions. "We need to stay together," said Helena, the golden-haired girl, her voice trembling but determined. "No," replied Theseus, surprising everyone. "The Minotaur will find us more easily if we are grouped together. We need to split up, but we'll die alone," protested Callias, the scribe, clutching his parchment to his chest. Theseus looked at each of them. "Listen up. I have a plan. When I find the Minotaur, I'm going to fight him. You need to hide, seek shelter in niches and side passages. If you hear me," he hesitated, "if you hear me shouting, run in the opposite direction." Pericles, the young groom, stepped forward. "I won't let you fight alone." "You must," insisted Theseus. "Your fiancé is expecting a son. If I fail, you'll have to find another way." Reluctantly, the group began to split up. Theseus watched as they disappeared into different corridors, their footsteps echoing further and further away. Alone now, he began his own journey, carefully unwinding the golden thread. The labyrinth was a masterpiece of engineering and evil. Corridors ended abruptly in smooth walls. Stairs led to impossible places, and some passages seemed to change direction as they were traversed. Theseus kept an eye out for the signs Ariadne had mentioned. small marks on the walls that indicated the proximity of the labyrinth's center. Time lost its meaning in the bowels of the labyrinth. Minutes could be hours, and hours could be days. The only certainty was the golden thread that glowed softly, marking the path taken. From time to time, Theseus heard distant cries. Echoes of voices that could be his companions were just tricks of the labyrinth. The first real sign that he was approaching the center came in the form of marks on the walls, deep scratches made by powerful claws or horns. Occasional bones lay in the corners, some still with scraps of fabric stuck to them. Theseus pressed the dagger into his tunic, feeling his heart race. Then he heard it, a deep, reverberating sound, half roar, half human groan. The ground shook slightly beneath his feet. Theseus pressed himself against a wall, controlling his breathing. The sound was closer now, accompanied by heavy footsteps that made the torches flicker. "I can smell you, Athenian." A guttural voice echoed through the corridors, startling Theseus with its clarity. Ariadne was right. The Minotaur could speak. "Your fear is sweet, like all the others before you." Theseus closed his eyes for a moment, centering himself. He remembered his training, the fights he had won, Ariadne's look of hope. When he opened them again, he was ready. "I'm not afraid of you, Ariadne's brother," he answered aloud, surprising himself with the firmness of his words. "I'm sorry." A roar of fury shook the walls. The footsteps became faster, more determined. Theseus gripped the dagger tightly, his body as tense as a bowstring. The moment that would change the fate of two cities was at hand. A monstrous shadow appeared on the opposite wall, cast by the light of the torches. The creature moved with surprising grace for its size. Theseus could hear its heavy breathing, feel the heat emanating from its massive body. "Pity?" The Minotaur's voice was closer, laden with bitterness. "You know nothing about me, Prince of Athens. About loneliness, about being a prisoner in your own home, about being feared by your own mother." Theseus felt an unexpected pang of compassion. For a moment, he saw the situation through the creature's eyes. Born of a forbidden love, condemned to live in the shadows, fed human flesh by a father who despised him. But there was no time for philosophizing. The Minotaur appeared around the bend in the corridor, its imposing figure blocking the entire passage. It was even more impressive than the stories described, taller than two men, rippling muscles covered in dark fur, long horns as sharp as swords. Its eyes, however, were disturbingly human, shining with intelligence and fury. "Then let's get this over with," said the Minotaur, lowering his head in an attacking position. "Show me if your feather is worth anything when you're being dismembered." The ensuing battle would echo through the corridors of the labyrinth, a struggle not just between man and beast, but between fate and free will, between the curse of the past and the hope of the future. The golden thread glowed softly on the floor, a silent witness to the clash that was about to begin. The confrontation exploded in quick, precise movements. The Minotaur charged at Theseus, who dodged at the last moment, feeling the displacement of air caused by the sharp horns passing inches from his body. The narrow corridor limited the creature's movements, giving the prince a slight advantage. Nimble as a mouse, roared the Minotaur, turning with surprising speed. But everyone tires eventually. Theseus kept his distance, studying his opponent's movements. Years of combat training had taught him the importance of patience. The bronze dagger pulsed in his hand, as if responding to the creature's presence. "Why do you continue to serve Minos?" asked Theseus, dodging another attack. "He keeps you prisoner, uses you as an instrument of terror." A bitter laugh echoed off the walls. "And where would I go? Look at me. The outside world would hunt me down like an animal." The Minotaur attacked again, this time managing to tear off a piece of Theseus' tunic with its claws. The fight took them deeper into the labyrinth, through narrower and narrower corridors. The golden thread snaked behind them, glowing softly. In a moment of distraction, Theseus tripped over an ancient bone, momentarily losing his balance. The Minotaur seized the opportunity, its huge claw closing around the prince's arm. The pain was immediate and intense. Theseus felt himself being lifted off the ground as if he weighed nothing. "Your fine words cannot change what I am," roared the Minotaur, bringing his face close to the prince's. His breath was hot and charged. His breath was hot and carried the metallic smell of blood. With a desperate move, Theseus drove his dagger into the creature's shoulder. The enchanted bronze penetrated the flesh with surprising ease, causing the Minotaur to cry out in pain and let go. The prince fell heavily, rolling away as his opponent struggled. "Damn it," thundered the Minotaur, pulling out the dagger and throwing it away. Black blood oozed from the wound. The smell, this metal has been blessed by priestesses. Her eyes narrowed with understanding. "Ariadne, my own sister betrayed me. She wants to end this cycle of death," replied Theseus, frantically searching for a makeshift weapon. His fingers found a long, sturdy bone. "It's not betrayal to want justice." "Justice?" The Minotaur's laugh was full of bitterness. "Where was justice when I was locked up here as a child? When my own mother couldn't look me in the eye?" The fight resumed with renewed intensity. Theseus used his agility to compensate for his opponent's brute strength. Looking for an opening, the bone in his hands broke when he parried a particularly strong blow, but it served to deflect the deadly horns. In the midst of the fight, distant shouts echoed through the corridors. The other young Athenians, probably discovered by the guards who occasionally patrolled the labyrinth. The Minotaur smiled, revealing sharp teeth. "Looks like your friends have run into trouble," he teased. "Maybe you should have stayed with them instead of trying to take me on." Theseus knew he had to end this quickly. His companions needed him, and every moment of fighting diminished his chances of survival. He observed his surroundings, noticing a torch that cast dancing shadows on the walls. With one swift movement, he snatched the torch from its holder and brandished it at the Minotaur. The creature recoiled instinctively, even though it was partially human. The ancestral fear of fire was present in its taurine nature. "You don't have to die," said Theseus, stepping forward with the torch. "We can find another way." For a moment, something akin to hope shone in the creature's eyes, but it was soon replaced by anger. "There is no other way for me. This labyrinth is my prison in my kingdom, and here you will meet your end." The Minotaur charged with all his might, ignoring the torch. Theseus waited until the last moment before throwing himself to the side, using the monster's own strength against him. The horns dug deep into the stone wall, momentarily trapping the creature. At that crucial moment, Theseus saw his dagger lying a few paces away. He rolled towards the weapon, grabbing it as the Minotaur broke free with a roar of fury. The creature turned around, blood dripping from its damaged horns, its eyes now completely dominated by bestial fury. "You're fast, Prince," it growled, "but you're getting tired. I can feel your heart racing, your fear sweating." "It's not fear," replied Theseus, wielding his dagger. "It's determination." The narrow corridor echoed with the sounds of battle, metal against claw, flesh against stone, roars and cries of exertion. The golden thread shone ever more brightly, as if responding to the violence of the confrontation. The fight that followed was brutal and desperate, man and beast dancing a deadly choreography in the confines of the labyrinth. The fate of two cities, the future of a princess, and the lives of innocent young people hung by a thread, as delicate as the golden ball that marked the path through the darkness. And amid the chaos of combat, an ancient truth echoed through the corridors. Sometimes the real monsters are not those who bear horns and claws, but those who create them and imprison them in the shadows. The decisive moment came when the Minotaur, at his fiercest, crashed into an ancient calm. The impact caused stones from the ceiling to crumble, creating a shower of debris. Theseus took advantage of the momentary distraction to execute a move he had practiced hundreds of times in his training, a precise and deadly blow. The dagger found its target between the creature's ribs, penetrating deep into its heart. The Minotaur staggered, its eyes wide with a mixture of surprise and, surprisingly, relief. "So, this is how it ends," muttered the creature, its voice losing its bestial fury and taking on an almost human tone. Maybe it's for the best." Black blood oozed from the wound as he leaned against the wall. Theseus maintained his combat stance, but something about the vulnerability of the moment struck him. "You could have chosen another path," he said softly. "No," replied the Minotaur, sliding down to sit on the floor. "This has always been my destiny. Take care. Take care of Ariadne. She was always the only one who saw me as something more than a monster." With these words, the creature exhaled its last breath. Theseus remained silent for a moment, paying silent respect to the being who, despite everything, was also a victim of the cruelty of men and the whims of the gods. The distant sound of screams brought him back to reality. His companions still needed him. Following the golden thread, Theseus ran through the corridors, first finding Helen and Callias hiding in a niche. Soon after, he located Pericles and 3 other young men. One by one, they came together, guided by the light of the enchanted thread. "The guards," warned one of the girls. "They've entered the labyrinth behind us." "Follow the thread," ordered Theseus. "It will lead you to the exit. I'll delay the guards." "We can't leave him," protested Pericles. "You can and you must," insisted Theseus. "Your mission now is to take the news to Athens. The Minotaur is dead. The bloody tribute is over." Reluctantly, the young men followed the golden path while Theseus faced the guards in the labyrinthine corridors. His combat experience and knowledge of the way through the wire gave him the advantage. One by one, the Cretan soldiers were neutralized or disoriented in the darkness of the labyrinth. When she finally emerged into daylight, she found the courtyard in chaos. Ariadne had fulfilled her part of the plan, creating a distraction that allowed the young Athenians to reach the port. The black ship was waiting for them, its sails already unfurled in the wind. "Theseus," Ariadne's voice cut through the air. She was running towards them, pursued by guards. "My father, he's found out everything." King Minos' furious roar echoed through the courtyard. "Traitor, my own daughter plotted against Crete." Theseus grabbed Ariadne's hand, and together they ran towards the harbor. Behind them, chaos ensued in the palace, servants running, guards shouting orders, and above all, the thunderous voice of Minos promising revenge. The road to the ship seemed endless. Arrows whizzed around them, some whizzing dangerously close. Theseus could see his companions on the deck, gesticulating frantically. Pericles and 2 other stronger boys had stayed behind to help them escape, keeping the guards at bay with improvised oars as weapons. With a last-ditch effort, Theseus and Ariadne jumped onto the ship just as the moorings were being cut. The wind filled the black sails, and slowly the ship began to move away from the quay. "It's not over," roared Minos from the dock. "The gods will avenge this betrayal." Ariadne, panting but determined, faced her father one last time. "The gods have already avenged us, father. Their cruelty created their own monsters, and now they are no more." As Crete receded into the horizon, Theseus watched the young Athenians. Now free, their lives ahead of them. Some wept with relief. Others laughed nervously, hardly believing in their survival. Ariadne stood beside him, her eyes fixed on the future that awaited them. "What do we do now?" she asked softly. Theseus touched his father's ring, remembering his promise to return. "First we go back to Athens." Then he smiled. "Then we build something new, something better than labyrinths and sacrifices." The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky with the same colors that Theseus had seen on his last night in Athens. But now these colors didn't resemble blood. They resembled possibilities, new beginnings, the promise of a future where monsters no longer had to be created or imprisoned. The golden ball, still attached to his tunic, shone with the last rays of the sun, as if approving of the direction their lives were taking. On the horizon, Athens awaited them, and with it, the chance to tell a different story, not just one of heroism and monsters, but of compassion, change, and redemption. As the ship cut through the waters of the Aegean Sea, Theseus knew that there were still battles to come. Minos would not rest easy, and the gods were known for their capriciousness. But for now, it was enough to know that 14 young people were breathing the air of freedom. that a princess had chosen her own destiny, and that in the depths of a labyrinth in Crete, a cycle of violence had finally come to an end.